In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes, and then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here. What do you want to start with?
Where shall I begin? I'm like Dr. Evil. My youths were spent in Rangoon, wherever you want to go. Kind of eclectic and go in any direction.
I know that, and that's the tough part of having a conversation with you is the conversation can go literally anywhere.
We could start just where I grew up and
let's start with your background
and why I got into where I'm at.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, so I was coming up in the 80s in South Florida as a little kid, little tyke. My dad was a contractor, and he did quality control for essentially owners, the people that would finance skyscrapers. And so I grew up always being aware of construction. He had built a bunch of additions onto our house. And he was a very, very handsy guy. And South Florida was a really cool area to grow up in, especially in the 80s, because we still had access to the original nature.
Yeah.
Where I was in Fort Lauderdale, if you headed west a little bit, you were right in the Everglades, and that's before they encroached on it too much. And then if you head out into the ocean, you could still, catch huge billfish. And it was what they call a sportsman's paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sports in Florida was always great. We had all the different, I guess you'd say, minorities live there. And I grew up playing soccer.
So you're a cultured white boy.
I was a cultured white boy because even most of my white friends, especially in the soccer world, were Hispanic.
Yeah.
A lot of Venezuelans, a lot of Colombians. And I would grow up going over to their houses and eating green mango and eating all these exotic, what are considered exotic things.
Yeah.
And, South Florida is just a hodgepodge. It's a crazy hodgepodge. And so for me, that's all I knew. So I didn't think that was anything exceptional, because when you're a kid, you just have that narrow focus.
Right.
And it was kind of cool with my father because he was very into construction. And I guess if I would have had a higher consciousness, an adult consciousness, I might have seen him as a conspiracy theorist, because he would always make these little comments don't have a mortgage. It's better to buy all your materials and build it as you go. He would always drop these little hints on things. And we had a lot of hurricanes. I think it was in like 1983. I forget what year it was, but we had a bunch of hurricanes roll through. And we saw a lot of devastation, like a lot of the old Florida homes. Actually, the old Florida homes fared much better than the homes that were being built in like this
current homes
in
now?
the 60s and 70s.
Uh-huh.
Well, they would vacillate. You know, I got to learn about politics a lot because like if there wasn't a hurricane for a few years, they would change all the building codes to cheaper materials. And then we'd have a hurricane and then they would change all the building codes to like better building materials. But what was happening for me is I was getting a phenomenology. Like my dad would show me wood, like Dade City pine, which no longer exists. It was farmed out by the 30s in South Florida. And that pine, when you built with it, it essentially made like a invincible floor, or whatever you framed with it was invincible. The bugs didn't eat it and all this stuff. And so he was always telling me about like the higher quality building materials and like all that type of stuff, even though I was a kid and I wasn't like actually in any trades. And so between like that always having like the construction thing going on one side, and then I had sports, like I played a ton of soccer, then got into football, got into tennis. And my parents actually met on do you remember the tennis player? You probably don't. Chris Evert.
No.
She was a famous pro tennis player, women's tennis player. Her father, Jim Everett, had a tennis court in Fort Lauderdale that was very famous. And that's where my parents met.
Okay.
So tennis was always in the background for me. Loved watching Wimbledon. And like I was a ball boy they called it the Lipton. I think it's the Miami something or other now. It's on the tour for the tennis, the pro tennis circuit. So I had tennis, soccer, and football. Those were like my things. And I found, and I was also like very artistic because my dad being an architect, we always had drafting tables in our house. And that was really kind of cool for me to like look at. My dad could draw anything, and I loved his writing. He had the architect's writing where he could like write so precisely and small. And I always wanted to emulate that, and I did. And we would draw. Like I was his second marriage, and I was the only child in his second marriage. I had two sisters from a previous marriage, but I was essentially an only child. Mm-hmm. So I got a lot of attention that way. And he would always like chronicle the things I would create with erector sets and Legos. And like, he just empowered me a lot with everything in that regard. Whatever I was creating or whatever I was doing, he was always like, you finish what you start, you see it all the way through, you do as best as you can. And there wasn't like a result orientation. It was always a process orientation, which I found like it was all that I knew. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know that other people had other
fixated on a goal.
Right.
Like, yeah. That's how most people are raised, especially in the sports world too.
Right.
Yeah.
And my parents actually got me into soccer because I was a little bit like Forrest Gump. I had extreme, my feet were splayed
out, like duck walking.
Yeah. To the point, like when I was learning to ride a bike, I had bloody heels.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. Like I was very awkward. And so they wanted to break my legs and reset them. And my parents were like, are you sure that's like the best thing to do? Are there any alternatives? And they're like, oh, well, you could have them run. So I got into calisthenics and running and soccer very, very early. I think I started at age 5, and I just took off with that and did really well with that. And so even though I was into drawing and into building and doing all these things like mechanically, I noticed around age 12, like girls liked the athletes. And so that's where my attention went. I was like, okay, got to win the girls. And also I was good at it. Like I excelled. I did really well.
You're an All-American in football, right?
In high school I was a freshman All-American at Michigan State.
Yeah.
So I never made like the AP All-American team. I was second
as a kicker at Michigan State.
Yeah, as their field goal kicker, kickoff. I didn't do punting. I was backup punter. But yeah, I did in high school football in Florida. I think is a lot like
Texas.
Texas.
Texas. I know exactly what you're describing.
It's just like football is king.
Yeah.
And like when I was coming up, Florida State, Miami, and University of Florida were like the top dogs. They were always rotating through the national championship. So we always had like intense, like, pickup football games. Like when I would describe to my friends in Michigan, like, I was like, yeah, on a Saturday afternoon, we would play 2 sets of full 11-on-11, full contact pickup football games. They're like, what?
Dude, that's like unheard of. I grew up in Kansas and we'd play like, I don't know, like sevens football, right? But never full contact 11-on-11 on a Saturday.
We would literally, like, my best friend and I, we would in the morning, we'd ride our bike to Central Park. We'd play tennis for a couple hours. Then we'd ride back. We'd get something to eat. Then we'd ride to the closest football field. And then it was in this neighborhood where there was just a bunch of boys. And like literally kids would drive in, like they would have their parents drop them off, and we'd play 2 sets of full 11-on-11 and we didn't have flags back then. It was contact.
Contact.
Yeah. And it wasn't like there was anybody out there refereeing. Nobody was wearing helmet. Like it was like full on.
Did you find that sort of forced you to, I don't want to get off on like make this a football episode, but I mean, I played sports growing up and I played football too. Did that sort of force you to have really good form tackling though, because you didn't have any padding on? Because I've always had this theory that rugby relative to football, rugby has far less major injuries than football does, as I understand it. That also could be totally wrong, but it's because in rugby, because you have less padding, you're forced to have really good form when it comes to tackling.
Yeah, now that you say that, it wasn't a conscious thing, but now that you say it that way, that makes sense to me, because I don't ever remember any of us getting injured out there.
Yeah.
Like maybe like a little soft tissue thing here or there. But I remember the first time playing for a high school team and like seeing with pads on, and we had this kid on our team that would spear people. For those of you that don't know, that's when you lead with your head.
Yeah.
Like you make your whole body a spear. And I was shocked because I never saw that.
Yeah.
Like that would never happen in our 11-on-11 games.
Right.
But like the whole thing about all of that football was that it was a hyper competitive environment, and it was like it ended up like really like whatever drive I had in me was like accentuated by that. And then my dad ended up sending me to the biggest high school in our area, against the will of my mother, because my mother wanted me to be like an academic person, and my dad's like, he's excelling in sports. He should play in the biggest. If he's going to be a big fish, he has to be in a big pond.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like a huge culture shock for me, because I ended up going from like essentially like a private Jewish prep school. It wasn't labeled Jewish, but that's where all the Jewish kids were going, where I was like the biggest, brawniest, kid. And then I end up going to this public school, and I'm like the pipsqueak.
Yeah.
I was as a freshman, I was this height. I was like, I'm only 5'9". So I was big for my age, but I was looking at like seniors and stuff like that, and these were like full grown men,
especially on the football team too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I was like, and it was back then it was the largest classification, so our school almost had 3,000 people in it.
Oh my God.
And it was like a class. We were in a class of 900 kids, and it was like, what a culture shock going from a class of 50 kids to a class of 900. The level of competition and everything. And so I chose to focus on being a kicker. I played to my strengths, It's
honestly pretty smart,
yeah,
right?
No,
Instead of competing for like the super athletic positions, you compete for the technical ones that no one else wants to do anyway.
Yeah, I saw it, and I was just like, I just read the room, because I ended up playing as a freshman. They had me play defensive end on JV, and I did good. I could outsmart the people I was playing against. I couldn't out physical them, but the writing was on the wall. So I chose to kick, did really well at that, was an all-state kicker for my high school, and got a scholarship to go to Michigan State. go up to Michigan State, and now I'm an outlier again there because like the culture of, central Michigan, it was like so opposite to what I experienced in South Florida. Like I could not relate.
Mm-hmm.
Like I couldn't relate. Like, for example, like in Florida, like when we would go out, we would look nice, we would usually like wear something that was, we'd wear nice duds and we'd go out, and none of us wore hats down there, especially like if we were going out, like especially if we were like going out to meet girls and stuff like that. And like, it was just up in Michigan, everybody had an addiction. Everybody was wearing their hats, brims over their eyes. It was all plaid all the time. And I was just like, where am I? And so that was kind of a culture shock to me. So I insulated myself with my football team. Like a lot of my best friends, we called each other brothers, and they were all from Florida. We had a group of like 9 guys that were all starting for Michigan State. And well, I shouldn't say they were all starting. There were 9 of us from the same county.
Right.
And a bunch of us were starters. All of us played, but a bunch of us started, and we had a really good time. And we were kind of bringing like the South Florida culture that we knew up there to just make it livable. Because like central Michigan during the winter is like, I didn't know this when they were recruiting me, but it's the second cloudiest city in all of the United States. Oh boy,
that's a shock right there too. Going from
like the
Florida
seasonal effect disorder. So in an odd way, it started to teach me about all the stuff we know about light therapy now. Because I literally had friends that would have 1,000-watt box of light bulbs that they would just like put this like cape over their head and stick their head in this light bulb box. That was the only thing that would ameliorate their seasonal effect disorder.
Wow.
And it's like, it was this is mid 90s. So we were learning about all that back then. But it was really cool at Michigan State because I befriended a bunch of the people that were in the biomechanics department. So they would film me and put like all the little dots on me and have like a green screen behind me and like film my biomechanics. So I became this like super like video nerd on looking at biomechanics. And then I had a coach that was really into biomechanics also. Like he was like, I forget what his major was in college.
Kinesiology or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. But it was like biomechanics were everything. And I just became a nut for that. And so as my college career progressed and I would get injured and then remedy the injury, I essentially went through pretty much all like the Western world's ways of dealing with the type of ailments that I was dealing with. And they didn't work.
Shocker.
Yeah. Like prednisone was like, they had me on 5 milligrams of prednisone for 3.5 years.
That's insane.
Straight.
That's insane.
So all the irritable bowel stuff I had, and I would come to them with that. They were like, oh, we don't know. Here, take this.
Right.
So I had, by the end of my football career, I had a bunch of ailments and a ton of pain, and I didn't really want to play anymore because I was in so much pain. And it was just by happenstance, I was dating a girl that suggested that we should take yoga as an elective my last semester in college. I was kind of like apprehensive. She's like, we should just try it. And I was like, okay. And I go in and I was like, this is heaven. Cause I was the only dude, it's 1998. It's like, 27 girls and me. And the yogini, she wanted to embarrass me. But she had no idea. I just went through 4 years of hell with football coaches. There was nothing that she could do or say or anything.
So she was like trying to get it in your head, under your skin.
She's like, you have the absolute worst body for yoga.
And wait, correct me if I'm wrong. Nick Saban was an assistant coach at
He was the head coach.
He was the head coach at Michigan State this time. Yeah. So there's no way some yogini compared to Nick Saban. No chance. Zero.
No.
Zero chance.
No, George Perlis was the coach that recruited me. To tell you the truth, if Nick Saban would have recruited me, I wouldn't have gone there. I didn't. He and I did not get along. I'm a person
said that before.
I'm a person that deals really well when somebody positively drives me. he didn't have that.
Yeah.
That wasn't his way, especially because when this was his first gig as a head coach.
Well, in coaches like that, I'm relating this to college basketball, the likes of like Frank Martin and who coached my brother at Kansas State University, like the really, really intense ones who do happen to have, some good couple of years, they are the ones that end up getting offered like the next best job much quicker than the ones who are less intense and have good years.
Yeah.
It's like that personality is attractive to athletic directors, I think, and they're willing to hire that quicker.
And he was always leveraging that with us as players. Like he would tell us flat out that he was just using Michigan State as a stepping stone. Like a bunch of us were going to leave and declare to be pro after our junior year. Because I led the Big Ten my junior year in field goal percentage and field goals made.
Wow.
And I had already kicked something like 42 field goals in games, like made. And I was like, I kind of know what I'm doing. And I had kicked with a bunch of pros at different camps and smoked them. Like, I was just like, and then it was actually a Texas boy, Phil Dawson, and we were number 1 and number 2 in the country. And so Saban was leaving between my junior and senior year. He was going to go be the Giants head coach. And so there were like 8 of us that were going to be seniors, but we were juniors. And back then in the NCAA transfer portal, they were essentially like, if your coach leaves, you can transfer anywhere you want. And you don't have to sit out.
Conference or no conference?
It didn't matter.
Wow.
If your coach leaves, you can go anywhere. And so I was either going to go back to a Florida school if he left and, finish my last year. I had a girlfriend at Florida State. So I was like, my dad ran track for FSU and I was like, hey, Seminoles, awesome. Let's do it. I didn't really have that much loyalty to Michigan State. I just like on so many different levels, like I appreciated the campus. I thought it was very beautiful. I really appreciated my econ professors, but like once you're in like professional sport, like a lot of people don't know, like college football is a professional sport.
100%.
Especially when your coaches are always talking to you about money.
Yep.
They're always telling you how much they're going to make. And like, if you fail, what they lose, like it's not like, I always try to explain that to my mother because my mother is sort of like a goody two shoes and like believes in all the authorities and stuff like that. And I'm like, Mom, we pulled in $55 million of revenue for the university. I'm like, this is a professional thing.
100%.
Oh, but they're paying for your scholarship. I'm like, that's nothing to them. Right. It's not like there's like, oh, this amount of money. Like it's literally, they're just adding one person to a roster.
And it's exploitative in a way. It's not as much anymore, but it's exploitative in that you weren't seeing any of that money. Or unless you were like the best player who was recruited by multiple people and then, okay, this booster is going to pay you and give your mom this car type of thing under the table.
And that's the thing I liked about the Florida schools. It was so open that the boosters were paying kids.
Yeah.
Like I went to Florida State between my junior and senior year to go see my girlfriend during spring break. And like all the kids, all the players are like kids I went to high school with were like rolling up. They're like, Gardner, what? And like all gold. It was like neon Dion stuff. It was just like, and nobody cared.
Right.
Where up in Michigan, everybody had this air of like, oh,
putting on a show, pretending.
Yeah. Whereas like if you were a hockey player or a basketball player, then you were a king.
Yeah.
That's when you could get away with whatever. And I was like, this is all revenue. Mm-hmm. This is business. This isn't. And there was like a great education for me on that level of life.
Yeah.
But like getting back to the yoga thing, like, I did yoga for a couple months and I had no more pain. I didn't have to go to chiropractic anymore. I got off the prednisone and then like my body. And then I got into all these breathing techniques. I got into a Vipassana practice and like I went to an NFL camp and my roommate was like, hey, have you ever tried transcendental meditation? And I'm like, no, what's that? And like, he starts, leading me in a meditation, and like, I literally like left my body. And I came back and I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Like, I was just like, I was really blown away, like with how quickly my body had shifted. And I was like, we were always being drug tested. So I wasn't into any type of drugs. I was, 21 years old, very, very fit. And now I'm into this yoga practice, and I'm down in Florida training. And I ended up signing with the Baltimore Ravens as an unrestricted free agent. And I was like a camp body for them. Matt Stover beat me out. So I was just like in the wings waiting. And then my agent's like, hey, you should play arena football because that will hone your skills, because the goalposts are much more narrow. And so I ended up, playing for my hometown team down in South Florida, what were they? The Miami Bobcats, something like that. And it was so crazy. It was like, I was so arrogant. I was like, I'm a 4-year starter in the Big Ten. Like,
what am I doing playing arena football? Right.
But it did make me better.
That's interesting. So an argument can be made that like there's more technical skill required for arena football kickers.
You're kicking at a 9-foot post, not an 18-foot post.
Totally makes sense.
And also on your kickoffs, they can return, like your kickoffs are bouncing off a net unless you put it through, unless you kick a field goal.
Right.
And so that was like, it did make me better. Like, it was one of those things. And then also I got to drop kick, which I loved. That reminded me of my soccer days when I was a goalie and I would drop kick. So it was fun doing that. But what was fun was I ended up working out at this high school where the Minnesota Vikings players like Randy Moss and Chris Carter, a bunch of like, God, I forget which Rocket Ishmael. There was like two Rocket Ishmaels, or you probably don't know these players, but they were like really famous. One played for Notre Dame. The other one played for Syracuse. I played with the one I was kicking to the one that went to Syracuse. Mm-hmm. And Chris Carter is like, hey, let's go do some yoga. I'm like, what? You're into yoga? And so he took me to his Bikram yoga class. They could call it Bikram because it was actually Bikram's wife's studio in Boca Raton. And we were doing hot yoga and just like sweating it out. And like, I thought it was like the best thing ever. So I ended up becoming a hot yoga instructor. That's what they like, the competitors to Bikram, they just called it hot yoga, but it was the same thing. Yeah. I changed a few things. And then I started modifying the practice because I was dealing with a lot of older people that couldn't handle the heat. And so I was like living my best life. I was like, when I say that at that time, like I was living in South Florida, I would kick during a short little season. I would be refining my body and the control of my body through the yoga practice. I lived in an apartment complex on the ocean, a condo on the ocean where I didn't have AC on for years. Like I just let the ocean breeze, like the fresh ionized air come off the ocean. I rode my bike to half my clients, and I was dating a kinesiologist. She got me into massage because she's like, you're really good. You're like better than anyone we have in our office. I had all this free time, and like, I was like literally like everything that I was kind of interested in and like refining my body and myself was now becoming like an income opportunity for me.
Wow.
And
so it's almost a blessing you didn't make the Ravens.
My heart wasn't in it either.
Yeah.
Because I have to say I was soured on the whole thing in college. Mm-hmm. Like I remember the minute I lost my drive. It was like my senior year. I had 3 field goals against Notre Dame my senior year, and I was content. And that's when I lost it. Because when I was coming up, I never had the dream to play in the NFL. The only dream I really had was to beat Notre Dame.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that? Like, what's that?
My dad
Did you
went
hate the movie Rudy or something
No,
like that?
my dad went to Florida State.
Oh, okay.
And in 93, Notre Dame beat
Yeah.
Florida State. And that was the year I was being recruited.
Okay. Got it.
So the reason why I chose to go to Michigan State out of all schools was I was being recruited. Florida State told me, we have the number one kicker in the country. He's a freshman. We're not going to recruit any more kickers. And I was like, understood.
Mm-hmm.
I was like 5th or 6th in the country. Notre Dame rolls in and they're like, you're not top 3 in the country. You can walk on. And I'm like,
yeah, who are you?
I had some South Florida attitude,
Right.
man. I'm like, first of all, who you says number one? I just beat him in a camp.
Uh-huh.
And I'm playing in Florida. He's from Tennessee. I'll smoke him.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had like that real,
yeah,
you know.
got you.
And so I just was like, I'm going to go to a school that plays you every year and I'm going to beat you personally. And that was my dream.
Wow.
And so I think I was 6 of 6 or 7 of 7 of field goals against them.
Really?
In my freshman year, I was even like, I remember after I kicked my 3rd field goal in the first half, I ran by Lou Holtz and I like flash gang signs. I was like, yeah, you're going to regret not having me go. So, but my senior year, I was kind of over that. I was just happy that we were like nationally ranked. We were like 6th or 7th in the country. We were getting a few games. We were about to play Michigan, who was number 1 in the country. And, but I had just felt a total contentment. I didn't have any more ambition. And part of that ambition was taken away because some of the coaches I dealt with in college were really deplorable people.
Yeah. I mean, even like how you're talking about Nick Saban, I'd imagine his coaching staff sort of trickled down in terms of how much they try to get under your skin and are not positively reinforcing you, encouraging you.
Yeah, there were some good guys on the staff, but some of the staff that I had to deal with directly, hyper hypocritical, I'm not somebody that can follow somebody that I feel is a hypocrite.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I've never been able to do that. And like, I would just like, I didn't want to be associated with those men. I didn't want to help them in any way. Like, I was just like, ugh.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I had some momentum though, because I did so well in college. So I played a few years in the Arena League and then played in the USFL for 1 season before that folded. Mm-hmm. And by that time I had already been massaging and teaching yoga. And like I said, I was just having like this like crazy fun life. Mm-hmm. Like, cause I was like literally riding my bike to work in the Florida sun. You know, it didn't matter that I was sweaty because I was just jumping into some sort of like
activity where you'd be sweaty
athletic
anyway.
Thing. Yeah. And that was a feeder for all my massage clients. And like, it was just awesome. Like I was really enjoying life. And then I was really exploring Eastern thought and Eastern practices when it came to getting my body right, getting my mind right. And I got into this, what would be called Vedanta Advaita, which is the path of non-duality. It's like, I guess you would say it's like the philosophical end of Hinduism. It's like, how do you get to the monad, you as an individual? And man, I read voraciously. Like I read pretty much every Nani, as they call it. You're either a Nani or a Bhakti. And like the Nanis that had been translated into English, I read them.
Can you explain the difference between Nani and Bhakti?
Bhakti is the path of devotion. Uh-huh. So usually that's more of a feminine pole component where like you can just submit. Mm-hmm. You can just utterly submit. And
devotion to God.
And trust. Yeah. And then you have the Nani, which is the path of knowledge.
So really, one you could say is a very head-based, and then the other one is heart-based.
Definitely.
Yeah. Because we were talking about this last night, how you said at one point you were a Nani, but the whole time underneath you were really a Bhakti.
I was always really a Bhakti.
Yeah.
Pretending to be a Nani.
Yeah. Do you think that there's... I would imagine that for a lot of people, especially people who are of non-Eastern traditions, that it requires at first that you become a Nani temporarily because you're seeking something that ultimately leads you back to here to be a bhakti.
Well, the funniest thing is in reading all these philosophical books on non-duality, the three main people that I found were like at the pinnacle. Each one of them said that being a nani resolves into being a bhakti. Because he said the end of the intellect is essentially in the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And the heart is where the sense of self is.
Yeah.
That's where the self emanates. And, you know, it's like a lot of people, it's so funny, like whatever spiritual or religious path somebody goes down, so many people don't actually read what what the sage or like what the prophet actually says.
They read like secondary work, opinion on
opinion on opinion. But when you actually read the sage or the prophet, it's so clear.
Yeah.
It's so clear. So for me, I just found like I devoted my life to it by my mid-20s.
You're living in an ashram, right? At some point?
Yeah, I moved into the ashram when I was about 27.
Okay.
Yeah, and then ended up going to India and, you know, going all the way to like the core of the Vedanta Advaita teaching, which they say it all essentially, not that at all, but like the prominent sage, his name was Ramana Maharshi.
Yeah.
And he died.
I think of a book by him.
Yeah. His philosophy is so funny because he's like literally like, I read all the dialogues that were ever recorded from him. And this is the tone of the dialogues. People would be asking him questions. And he'd be like, who's asking the question? Find out the I who wants to know this. But the mind is just busy. Like it just wants to be busy. The mind wants to be I did it.
Yeah.
And like what we were talking about yesterday, like the main problem with everything is identity. It's like, I, me, my mind, I, me, my mind. And he was so emphatic. It's like the I, me, mine is the joke. That's actually, that resolves into nothing. And so he completely would be in these dialogues with people and he'd be like trying to tell them like, okay, find out who it is that wants to know this. And just feel that, like essentially feel the core of you. That's all of it. And that wouldn't help it. Like, no, like people weren't getting it. And then he would go to the Nana aspect of it and he would just be like rolling his eyes. Like that's the tone. Like if God wants it to happen, try as you might for it not to happen, it's going to happen anyway. And if God doesn't want it to happen and you want it to happen, try as you might, it's not going to happen. He's essentially saying, you don't, it's not up to you. Quit. Like it is bhakti. It is the heart. It is trust. And he was saying it in his own way. And when you look at his life, like he chose to live on this mountain called Tiruvannamalai. And Tiruvannamalai in the Hindu culture is considered, at least in the Tamil culture of southern India, that's the embodiment of Shiva. And it was an old volcano. And like he ends up living on that mountain. Well, first when he finds out, to him, Shiva's a god. And he's like, wait a minute, I can go there? Like I can literally be at the feet of God? And so he drops everything and goes to Tiruvannamalai and like essentially like just becomes a hermit on the side of the mountain, almost dies from a certain infection or whatever, doesn't die. And then people literally over 16 years build an ashram around him.
Wow.
Like he was just sitting in a mango field, like chilling. And all these people come around him and are like, you're this, you're that. And he's like, who thinks that? Like he like, I just know the tone. It's just like, don't bother me.
Yeah.
Like, but he ended up I think by age 50 or so, just being like, okay, I'm obviously this is the role that needs to be played. But his whole thing that I'm trying to bring up was that he was just like, you live God's will.
Mhm. How do you know because we were talking yesterday about how some people claim to trust God with their ask, right? But then they have one foot on the brake.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess the first part of this question is, how do you know if you're in alignment with God's will? And then the second part is, how do you know if what you're asking is in alignment with God's will? And how do you surrender trust in that process, or give full trust and not have your foot on the brake in that process too?
I had a mentor in my 20s tell me, and he put it to me in a statistician way, because that's the way I could understand it. He said, think of the trillions of different options of thoughts that you could have right now, but yet you're having that thought. Is that by accident?
Can't be.
It can't be.
No.
And the more I get into knowing people's luminaries and knowing my own luminaries and like watching the path and all this stuff, nothing is by accident, like nothing. I don't believe in the fates per se, because the fates are directly tied to demigods.
Mhm.
And I do believe in free will, but free will is more about your attitude about what is occurring, not about you actually making what's occurring. It's a subjective experience.
Subjective interpretation of the objective thing that is happening. That makes sense.
Objective reality is God's. Objective reality is the truth.
Yeah.
How we interpret it and our attitude about it is where we actually have free will.
Yeah.
And so, just like, Raman Maharshi said, if God wants it to happen, try as you might for it not to happen, guess what? It's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing is, like, I was being immersed in the new age world. Like, I was being groomed to be like somebody to teach this to people. And because I can obviously communicate well,
Mm-hmm.
but I saw the folly in it.
Yeah.
Because it was just like, no, the new age, everybody wants to take credit for themselves as being the creator.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's like, I'm a manifester, I'm a projector. Like, you display those characteristics in attitude at times,
Mm-hmm.
but you are not the creator of all.
Right. And have you heard of the difference between like panentheism versus pantheism, where like, I might be getting those two things wrong, but it's the idea that there's a difference between true non-duality in the sense that there is only one being, which I think can be a very self-absorbed way of looking at things in some cases, right? Kind of what you're getting at. And then the other idea is panentheism, is that there is a supreme God that we are inextricably linked to, but we are still like distinct and separate, but can draw from it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the panentheism is closer to what we experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what I would call, I don't like labels, but that's what I would call myself, is like a panentheist.
Yeah.
Like, there's still a supreme God that I am absolutely not him, but I'm fundamentally a part of, inextricably linked to.
What was interesting is like, there are a few years there, especially right before my first Saturn return, where I was getting a little bit egotistical.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't say a little bit, actually hyper egotistical. Because I had just enough intellectual knowledge of things to be dangerous, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have enough worldly experience to like humble me.
Yeah.
But I knew enough to know that I wasn't enlightened. I knew that I wasn't. Like, I knew I had faults. I knew that I was like, I'm not clear. Because the way enlightenment was presented to me, because that was my goal, was to be enlightened. I was like, well, how do you know when you're enlightened? And I read everybody, and it essentially came down to when nothing ruffles your feathers. Like, when nothing can ruffle your feathers. My feathers would get ruffled on the daily. Like, so I knew internally, like, I was still processing so many things from my youth and all this stuff. And so I ended up being in this ashram. The ashram fails terribly. And my ex-wife and I are in the jungle of Costa Rica with a lot of land. And I don't know how to do anything besides massage people and teach yoga. I'm like the most useless of male, like
in terms of working with your hands. Yeah.
I could work with my hands, but
On
it was
body,
only manipulating a physical body.
Yeah.
And I had some drawing skills. I had a little bit of building skills because I could, I did some home renovations and things like that. And so here I am in the wilds of Costa Rica, no money, no prospects, like totally humiliated as the Saturn return wants to do. And it was a beautiful, humbling moment. Over the grace of like the next few years, I was just able to see that like I'm always provided for. I didn't have a bank account at the time. I was doing everything on barter. I decided that I wanted to build with domes because my South Florida,
Didn't you say you and your dad like saw an advertisement?
Dude, it was
like
so cool. I was like, I was 12 years old, and on 60 Minutes, there was this expose of this dome because this old man on the Barrier Islands in North Carolina, he had always lived on this one island, and he couldn't get insurance anymore because so many hurricanes had hit this Barrier Island. And so because he couldn't get insurance, he couldn't pay to rebuild a home there. Like nobody would finance him building a home. And so he's like, I'm not leaving. This is my island. He stuck his flag in the ground. And so he hired this Italian architect that had this new pneumatic way of pumping up this big air bladder with this type of concrete called ferro cement on top of it. And he essentially blew up this dome. It looked more like a flying saucer than it did like a hemisphere. And like 4,000 square feet inside, 2-story, like this big thing. In 60 Minutes admitted that they waited a year because another hurricane hit the island and the dome
was fine.
Did fine.
Yeah.
And I remember watching that with my dad one afternoon because we were building our new house and it was built conventionally. And I remember my dad, I saw the look on his face and he's like, that's the way. Like ferro cement. And like, because nobody even heard of what ferro cement is. And it's like literally the way, like, not to bore people, but it's like the way a lot of bridges are built. It's thin shell, flexible, mechanically strong cement. It performs really well whenever the earth moves.
What materials are used in it versus traditional
concrete?
Cement?
Well, it's a form of concrete. They shouldn't call it ferro cement because cement is a binder. They should call it ferro concrete. Ferro means ferrous, metal.
Okay.
So like metal. It's when the weight of the metal within your concrete equals the weight of the binder.
Okay.
So if cement is the binder, say you have an 80-pound sack of cement.
Yep.
And then you have 80 pounds of metal that's woven through whatever that sack of cement is. That's technically ferro cement.
Okay, got it. And
so a lot of bridges are built that way. And so when I saw this, like you could blow up a balloon and have a house, I was like, wow. And then also I grew up in Florida where we went to Epcot a lot. And so I was exposed to the Buckminster sphere, the buckyball.
Giant golf ball.
The big golf ball.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, as a little kid seeing that, it was so futuristic and you're like going into it with the monorail. I was like, whoa. Right. It was like, so for me, that was sort of like, those were like very memorable moments for me. And then moving down to Costa Rica, I wasn't heart set on domes at all, but we ended up having the first year that we were there, they had pretty much like one of the worst rainy seasons they had in a long time, followed by 2 like middle-sized earthquakes. So the ground was hyper-saturated, and then these 2 earthquakes pretty much just shook the hills, and all the hills kind of slid.
Damn.
And so I saw these really well-built homes. Like I knew that they were well-built. Like I knew the contractors who had built them and like were part of, like witnessed a couple of the builds, like very well done, but it didn't matter because the shape of the building wasn't appropriate.
Yeah.
Because shape matters.
Right.
And so that harkened me back. And I was telling my partner at the time, I was like, we can't afford to do that.
Mhm.
Like, we can't do that. Because if it fails, we're done.
Mhm.
Like it's over.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in Costa Rica, those buildings, even though they were built better, they obviously don't stand up to what now the type of buildings you're doing. But again, relative to what we're building here with drywall, with plywood and things like this, you're not even able to in Costa Rica because of the
bugs.
termite. Yeah.
The bugs and the humidity.
Yeah.
So you can have now a lot of the contractors, the architecture is like, the way the architecture is going is they're essentially getting rid of roof lines, which is the worst thing you can do in the tropics, especially because down there, we had one year down there where we had over 260 inches of rain. You don't have any eaves wicking the water away from your building. All that water ends up on your walls. So what you're spending in maintenance to keep a building looking right and the walls not having like mildew and mold and all the rest of it, like just totally like take over your area. And then there's so much water that ends up getting to your foundation. It's just like, it's crazy the amount of water that's in the tropics. So the roof lines where they're like, we're going to have a conditioned environment inside and we're going to use all these regular building materials. I find to be very foolhardy because those will fail.
Mm-hmm.
It will fail. And plus when I got there, that area of Costa Rica wasn't so refined. So we would lose power on the daily. So if you build a house that's like essentially hermetically sealed and it's super, humid and the AC goes out, you're living in a hellhole.
Right.
Like that you don't. And to me, I was like, why are you living in the tropics if you don't want the experience of the whole thing anyway? So that also goes back to my days living in South Florida, because the homes that did actually do really well in South Florida were the homes that were built in the 1920s, because they were all built on the principle of you stilt up, you go about at least 4 to 5 feet off the ground. You always have big eaves or larger eaves. You always use a concrete roof. You don't do tile. You don't do barrel tile. None of that. You have a cupola. The cupola is like essentially an opening in the middle of your roof where you have a secondary roof line so hot air could get out.
Okay.
So you elevate the building so cool air is low, hot air is high. And then all of those older homes, they always had essentially passive cooling because the north side of the building always had an eave. Oh, excuse me, the south side, both sides, the north and south always had eaves, but where the air would enter, the air could be cool, all the hot air could go out. And then you always had rooms where you had either east to west exposure with the windows or north to south. So you always had good pass through of air. So very like feng shui without it being like feng shui, like good flow. And those houses performed admirably. Like if your neighborhood flooded, it didn't matter because the house was 4 feet off the ground. It never flooded, past that, never, at least not my time there. And then, so you're not rotting out your floors or anything like that. They did stucco and lath, which is what I'm into now. That's like ferro cement is like a more modern way of doing stucco and lath. And they just had very good passive heating and cooling systems, mainly cooling because it's so hot down there, that kept the air fresh in the house. And so those homes did really well. But when the development really took off, usually the contractors that are building these developments, they want to make as much money as possible, right? Or the people that invest in the contractors do. So they go for cheapest practices, so they frame in white pine, which is like, to me, it's just white pine is like, you might as well just build with paper mache.
Right.
Like
that's what I was listening to some of your stuff the other day and I was like, it's literally building a rock versus building paper mache, like building a paper house, like a paper box, essentially. Because that's what we're living in modernity, especially in the West, is like just a bunch of paper boxes.
Yeah. And then I knew enough people in the drywall trade. Like I had a couple of clients of mine that I was massaging that owned contracting companies. And they were telling me the horror stories of drywall.
Mhm.
Like they go in to renovate a place and all of the back of the drywall is black mold.
God dang.
All of it.
Oh my goodness. And that's probably the norm too.
That is the norm.
That is so bad. And it's, again, for the people listening, it's not that black mold itself is bad, it's that it's decomposing toxic materials, which is bad. But that's
Right.
the whole point, is that drywall itself is riddled with toxicity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I already had that in the back of my mind. And then down in Costa Rica, there's this killer termite called a como hen. And it comes up from the ground. You don't see it fly in. Like in Florida, we had termites, but it wasn't like these termites.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Florida termites were like ants, and they would kind of fly, and they were kind of slow. If you'd see them, you would go ahead and do like a termite bomb in your house, and you're fine. The como hen, you would never know it until you went and put your hand on a post, and your hand went through the post.
So they stayed hidden on the underside.
They were in the inside.
Wow.
And would start in the inside and work their way out. And they always came up from the ground.
Oh, man.
So my goodness, it was like, I'm going to build with these hardwoods that are endangered anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if I'm building with hardwoods, I'm doing a post and beam house. And post and beam doesn't do good in earthquake zones anyway. So here I am taking down these massive trees to build post and beam, which actually isn't appropriate for this environment anyway. And it's so humid. Like if you're doing anything like any like wood product, you have to throw like 18 layers of sealer and varnish on it, which essentially then your interface with that is plastic.
Right. It's not actually the wood.
It's not the wood.
Right.
Like I had to explain that to clients over and over and over again. I'm like, it's nice to do all the wood stuff. Like I agree, it's pretty, but let's be honest about what you're interfacing with.
Mm-hmm.
You're interfacing with a hydrocarbon. Mm-hmm. You're interfacing with some sort of toxic varnish.
Mm-hmm.
And because I dealt with a lot of granolas. Like I dealt with a lot of people that were moving to Costa Rica for food sovereignty, wanting to be all organic, wanting all the like the most idealistic things and wanting it cheap. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. And the whole thing is like the things that look really shiny are usually not the best things for your body.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it's super shiny, so yeah, I got into the masonry side of things. And I still would use wood and wood adornments where it was appropriate, but I found the shape of the dome, and I played with different shapes. I started off with like the beehive dome shape from Cal Earth University. Nadir Khalili was the originator of that system, and he was a skyscraper builder in Tehran, Iran, in the 80s. And I think in the 70s, and in 1981, they had a 9.0 earthquake there, and it flattened Tehran.
Mm-hmm.
And he had that like super humbling moment of like, what am I doing? Because he looked over the landscape of the city, and the only buildings that were left standing were these old bakeries that were these beehive domes.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, that's the only way we should be building.
Yeah. That's where you look at all we were driving down Congress in Austin yesterday and looking at the Capitol building, and it's like that right there.
Yeah.
And there's a reason that has survived.
Exactly.
For however long it's survived.
Yeah.
And I had heard you say either yesterday or on another thing, I like binge all your stuff lately, about how most insurance companies basically plan for the homes or even commercial buildings that are being built to fail within 40 to 50 years. And it's like, oh, that passes the standard. And I think you said that your dad was like, no, I can't pass off on that. I can't check off on this.
My dad, like, he ended up kind of tanking his career because
standing on morals, essentially.
Yeah. The construction company that he was working for, they got the bid to build for Marriott. on Fort Lauderdale Beach. And the job essentially had the entire building on these massive sand and salt pillars. They weren't concrete, on the ocean.
Yeah.
And my dad was flipping his wig. He was just like, he's like, there's a tide. It comes in and out. Like, our water table's at 3 feet. Like, yeah, you can compact sand really good, and this is insufficient.
Yeah.
And the insurance adjusters told him, we only need it to be a 40-year life cycle. And he was like, so I was trying to explain this to my mother, because this was happening when I was 8 years old. So this is 1986.
Yeah.
Okay. When that happened. Literally in 2016, they started in 2014. They started the whole thing talking about how we have to tear down this Marriott and build a new complex. And they were pitching the sale of, oh, there's going to be X amount of commercial real estate. There's going to be, this, and this. And they were like hyping up this whole thing, this new area of Fort Lauderdale Beach that they're going to renovate and do anything. And I was like, Mom, they're just covering their butt for what my dad was talking about. They know if they don't take down that building, something really.
So that's the whole purpose of basically most big city full-scale renovation projects.
Yes.
Is because they know all the architecture is going to fail, so they have to. So they have to flood money in, and it's usually via tax dollars. So they're just siphoning money from people in order to fund those projects. Right. Insane, man.
And it was all because on the front side of it, to get it financed, they needed the cheapest bid.
Wow.
They literally needed the cheapest bid. And my dad had a real hard problem with that.
Yeah.
Because obviously he would get paid more if he went along to go, like if he went along with, but in this instance, I'm not saying in every instance, in this instance with construction, he had a very, very big moral quandary with it.
Yeah. So basically because of all that, that's like what led you to start building domes, essentially.
Yeah. There was, and before I left for Costa Rica, I went up into North Florida to look at a bunch of geodesic domes, because I was like, I could buy a kit. And then there were a couple people that own those kits down in Costa Rica in the area that I was moving to. So I was like, oh, okay, I can see what works and what doesn't. And if it's a kit, then I can build it myself, and then I don't have to pay a contractor. And I really liked the people that I was meeting in the dome world. Like, they're all weird, like me. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. But the geodesics didn't really work well in the tropics.
What was wrong with the geodesics in the tropics?
Mainly the joinery.
Okay.
So mainly these type of geodesics, they were built where you would just have a bunch of wood joints that would come and to one point. And when you have a really humid environment, like hyper humid environment in the tropics, you get so much swelling. Like, I mean, I think the driest wood I ever bought that was ever kiln dried down there still had like an internal humidity of like 27%.
Oh boy.
Which is unheard of in the States. Like now that I live in the Ozarks, it's like hilarious. I go buy wood and it's actually straight. I'm like, this is like, it's a novel thing for me to like, but down there, it's so humid. Like people, like I lived in 100% humidity. And when our dry season, it would drop down to 90% humidity.
Dude, that is insane.
For 15 years.
Wow.
Like, it was so funny because whenever I come back to see my parents, like I would pull my suitcase in and open it, and it just smelled like mold. Like, no matter what.
Yeah.
And like people couldn't understand, because down there you don't smell it.
Yeah.
Because there's so much mold and fungus. Like, you're just in it. And so I would tell my clients, I'm like, you're not building a house, you're building a submarine. And they were like, what do you mean? I'm like, you don't know what it is to live here, how humid it is. Like, it is humid. And so a lot of people would build with these metal roofs. I didn't like the energetics of the metal roofs.
So that's what I was going to ask too, because I've heard you talk about shipping containers and things like this, and like living in a metal box, especially with the amount of non-native EMFs that we have in this world.
Yeah.
And like even those of us who are familiar with that, you use devices, I use devices. Like being in a metal box is only going to just perpetuate negative effects related to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And down there, it's kind of crazy because we all thought we were, moving to pristine lands that had never been touched by man. Incorrect.
Yeah.
Like that whole area had been like mowed over a few times after the conquistadors by different like massive coffee and fruit magnates. And then I think like in that area, I believe Burger King and Wendy's bought like 10,000 hectares to run their cattle and stuff like that. And the Costa Rican government was always in cahoots with whatever multinational, corporation would pay them. Yeah, and they would just essentially, turn the agrarian system into, it was just like serfdom.
Yeah. And
so all of us gringos were moving down there and we're being idealists, which was a real funny thing because like, they're not like the native Costa Ricans are not idealists at all. They're like, it's super wet. We're building with concrete. And so I really appreciate how practical the Costa Ricans are, at least in the area that I was in. They're like, yeah, you want huge eaves. You want this, that, and the other. And get the water as far away from you as much as you can. So I get into the domes. I end up building these super adobe domes. I had a massage client that saw drawings that I was making for my wife and I for what we wanted to build. And he is like, that's exactly what I want. And I was like, great. And I was like, if you want me to build it, you have to send me to school to learn how. And he did. And I did. So wow. I went to Cal Earth. I was in Nadir Quilly's last class, which was really cool at Cal Earth. And his then wife, Ileona, she was like the main instructor. And then I took my practicum, with their lead builder in Joshua Tree National Park out there in California. And then I went immediately back to Costa Rica and built a 1,800 square foot tri-dome complex with this massive second story deck, outdoor living space with like, wraparound kitchen. Like it's pretty.
Do you have any pictures of that?
It's all online.
Okay.
Yeah. I have it on my
so we can show it as you're saying this.
Yeah. I have it on Instagram. It's the one that looked like cone heads,
Yeah.
And, my client was really cool. Like he let me like any client, artist relationship, there's always going to be some butting of heads. But for that to be like my first build was pretty significant.
Give you a lot of like artistic leeway in that?
He did in the design, but the problem was he ended up showing up on site about midway through the build. And then that kind of gummed up the works.
Ah, okay.
Like a lot of the things that I had designed that would have been better, he was like, he wanted to be part of the design process at that point. And
I understand that because it's kind of his, but it's also like for you, the masonry work is also an artistic expression. So it's like a weird, like, damn, I want to bring this art piece, this canvas that I'm painting to its full creation here.
Yeah.
Especially because you're so mindful of the energetics of things too. And that's the huge piece.
That's what pissed me off because literally he changed the feng shui of the building. Yeah. And I was livid because I always hate that. Like one of the things I do not like is when somebody puts a bathroom that opens up to a kitchen. That's just poor form.
Right.
Like I've been in enough restaurants. I know the deal. Like you just don't do that.
Yeah.
And he did that. And I was just like, because it was a money issue. It was like saving money and running pipes and stuff like that. And I was just like, no, this is not. But anyway.
But also the energetics in terms of like, I'm sure this wasn't impacted as much on this project, but I've heard you talk before about the specific ratios of things as it relates to your building design. And like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, like the golden ratio is incorporated into a lot of your work.
Yes. It wasn't then though.
Okay. It wasn't then. So can you talk to me about that in terms of building design and like the energetics, the palpable energetics that creates in a space versus these boxes that we're all living in right now?
It's like my favorite subject.
Yeah.
So it's when you go through like all of philosophy, it resolves itself in the study of aesthetics. What makes us attracted to something? What is attractive, whether it's an idea, whether it's a form or whatever. And the Platonists and the Neoplatonists talked about these forms, which is like the perfected, exalted thing, right? And that was in astrology, that's your midheaven. That's like what you aspire to. And it all has to do with what you personally find beautiful, because beauty is what actually creates an impetus, drive, energy in you. When you find something beautiful, there's more energy. And I say that to a lot of my clients is like, how do you know you're in love? There's always enough energy. How do you know you're not in love? There's not enough energy. Because when you're in love or there's love there, man, there's energy, there's juice, there's a push. And that's what beauty does too, is beauty, no matter who you are, what sex, whatever, when you find something beautiful, it like, ups the mitochondria output. Like for whatever reason, it just gives like a pep in the step. And so in nature, the ratio of 1 to 1.6147, whatever, I might be getting the last few digits wrong, is known as the golden ratio, because pretty much everything that we find beautiful has this proportion in it. And it's expressed on the XYZ axis. And this is known as philo-taxis. Philo, love. So we're getting back to that whole love beauty thing. And it's just proportional. Like some of the prettiest cars you've ever seen, some of the prettiest buildings you've ever seen, they encode this ratio in there. And the way a lot of these buildings that we've fallen in love with, that we're told like our founding fathers built, and we're told
we're going to talk about that.
Yeah. They almost all of them encode 3, 4, 5 rectangles, which is that is the start of the golden ratio spiral. And what does that do? When you have a shape, whether you can see it or feel it or not, that shape induces a flow of energy. So the reason why, getting back to why the domes perform so well in earthquakes and they perform so well in any type of windstorm, whether it's a hurricane or tornado, is that the flow dynamics around a dome, whether it's a conical dome, whether it's a lancet arch dome, whether it's a hemispherical dome, doesn't matter. The flow dynamics is that the air or whatever the fluid is that's moving over it doesn't get caught. It doesn't jam up. It's just like our body. It's like you're into Qigong. Like you're building the flow dynamic where the Qi can constantly move and easily move. In any of the areas where it gets stuck, the principle of Qigong is to like be able to slowly get the Qi to move through that area. Well, this you can do with any shape. The problem is when you have a cube, like for instance, this room is essentially a cube, you have 8 vertices. Okay, so the 8 vertices, if you were just to put a fan right here and push air that way, that would represent what we're talking about, flow dynamics. The air would stagnate and you would get dead spots where the air doesn't touch.
Yeah.
Well, a bunch of natural philosophers, the one that I talk about the most, like Victor Schauberger, was able to point out that in flow dynamics, what occurs, what gives an incredible flow dynamic to any area is the shape that you actually put in that area. And he found that the egg, which is the perfect shape, because if you look at an egg, the pointy part, its proportions are exactly that of a beehive.
Wow.
And if you look at the round part, that round part, or the more, let's call it hemispherical part, is more akin to what we know of as like a geodesic dome or what I build, which is a Japanese star dome. So the Hermeticists saw the pointy part as being the male, like the phallus, and the more rounded part being the female. So you have these two shapes, the male and female together, and what do you have inside? You have life.
Mm-hmm.
You have this new embryo that's growing, whatever it is. And this is this egg. You hear the Hermeticists talk about like the cosmic egg. And, this is what they're trying to say is where you have flow, where you have this flow, you have creation, you have life, you have a more healthy, you have more of a chance to beget life.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a cube, you have more of a chance to beget death. And I saw this firsthand because I'm learning these principles of flow dynamics, specifically from all these natural philosophers. But then I'm living in an area of the world where we have to build our own water tanks in Costa Rica. And so I was part of this build of this water tank. They were renovating an old water tank that had cracked. It was a cube. And so we get into the tank, and where you would not believe in each one of the vertices, the muck, the utter death that was in all the corners.
Mm-hmm.
And it harkened me back to what Schauberger was saying. It's like, you want to store your water in egg shape. You want to store your water where you have a flow dynamic. And then I had already seen that, you could say the exploded aspect of that, where that's talking about the flow dynamics within the shape. And I had at that point, I had already seen the flow dynamics outside of the shape with these hurricanes not affecting domes. So I was sold.
Yeah.
I was like, my goodness. And what occurs is when you get into the golden ratio and the golden section and all these things, you can use rectangular shapes that actually encode, because of their shape, the flow dynamic will create a spiral within it.
By using the rectangle
By using the rectangle at a certain proportion.
Okay. Is it rectangular with rounded edges though?
Well, that would help.
Yeah.
That would help. But the actual proportion itself, Frank Lloyd Wright was a famous architect and builder, and he would do this in his buildings where he would have all of his openings where light was coming through were these, the proportion was the golden section. And your body just knows it. It's an intuitive thing. It's not an intellectual thing. You'll just walk into a Frank Lloyd Wright building and be like, oh, this feels so good. I don't know why.
Yeah.
And then you'll walk into a modern architecture where the whole wall will be glass and you feel like crap.
Right.
Because it's not about how much light. In today's world, it's all about more is better. And that's not it at all. It's all about proportionality. Mm. And the term I always like to use, and our mutual friend Eileen Mikusic has since she's changed the term or rebranded it. I learned it as dynamic disequilibrium. Mm. And so you never want to have equal 50-50 with energetics. We're told, middle path, 50-50. Incorrect. Mm. That's monotone. You end up having death in that aspect. All the best art you've ever seen, all the proportionality that you've seen, it's like a teeter-totter. It's closer to 60-40 or 65-35 or 68-32. It's a big, and what this does is creates a dynamism of movement. Mm-hmm. And you can do that with the proportionality of how you do your rooms, even if you're going to build a square. Because I build mostly round buildings. I build a lot of buildings that are essentially a cylinder, as you walk into it. So you get the flow of that. But if you're to take the bird's eye view down, it's like conch shell.
Okay.
I've done 2 of those. It's really neat. The mass of the building, the exterior walls resolve into a conch shell shape. But internally, I would make sure that the flat wall spaces that I would build for bedroom spaces, the ratio of the wall height relative to the length of the room would give me that rectangle. that would build the golden ratio in. So I've been very lucky because the last 5 years, my clients have really let me kind of run with that and go for it.
That's kind of what I was getting at too, in asking, like, obviously this protects against wind, especially like wind shear with square buildings. They're just going to like fucking flatten in most cases. Right. But the actual effect on the human body, because I almost feel like this goes without saying for someone like you, but maybe people who are listening or watching this haven't really thought of this before. Aside from the toxins that are put into traditional building materials, especially in the West, the shape of the building, I think, is disharmonious to our bodies.
It really is. Yes. I would totally agree. Before I moved to Costa Rica, they had just released the Lord of the Rings movies, and seeing the hobbits in the Shire, I was like, whoa, like that just felt right, like to be in the ground in this round home.
Yeah,
and like I'm kind of built like a hobbit, so I was just like, those are my peeps, like I'm just like, that's awesome. It like, so for me, like that was like a very like natural way to go. Like, I'm like Hobbit Troll Clan, like it just, and the thing is too, is like because of my massage career, I've been afforded to like work on people in some of the top spas in the world. And when I noticed in every single one of these spas that were like felt so good to do energetics and body work and polarity therapy, those spas always had rounded and curved walls. And even if it was a box, they did like what you said, they would curve the vertices, or they would always have plants. You never felt the hard edge or the vacuous edge. And I was very lucky that the very first domes I built, it was very strenuous on me. Like I really took like a huge leap of faith to do what I did. And I had befriended a super practical German woman that had been living in Costa Rica for like 20 years at the time. And she didn't want any bells and whistles of anything. She wanted to know what it took to maintain something. That was her practical German nature. And the building had been up, the client had moved in, we were all friends with them, and we were over there. And so I was kind of like nudging her, I was like, what do you think? And she's like, this place is very easy to clean. And what she was pointing out was when you don't have vertices, there's no place for the bugs to go. And it's that flow dynamic.
Yeah.
It's the flow dynamic. And it was really true. Like I would have done, like I built for some clients that would run out of money, and we would just like leave the building there until the money came, And when we come back and like in the dome shape, you would have to clean up a little bit. But it was nothing like if you went to a normal box home in the jungle, where if you weren't there for like a week, like literally the spiders would come in, all the bugs would move in. This was a totally different thing, and it was because of the shape. It had a more harmonious, it was just more harmonious, and the lack of vertices really allowed for there to be a lack of bugs. Vertices equal bugs. That
makes sense.
In a place like Costa Rica where you had so many bugs, like, I mean, people like think like where I live now in the Ozarks has bugs. No. Like between the humidity and the bugs down there, like you were doing whatever you could. And then I ended up building closer to the coast, which was very hot. And the cool thing when you have such good flow dynamics is I could cool the building with like 1/10 the energy that it took to cool the volume, like by volume. So we had this like, it was around a 400 square foot studio dome that I built. One of my friends, he's a musician. He wanted very specific acoustics. And so we ended up building, it was a little bit more. It's like closer to 22-foot diameter dome. Single entrance, wanted a lot of reflecting going on with all the stuff. On my podcast, he's the music that you hear.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And so we build that, and it's just so hot down there. It costs us $40 a month to dehumidify and air condition that dome
In Costa Rica,
in
too.
Costa Rica
Wow.
a month.
That's it.
That's it.
Wow.
And the thing's always on.
Yeah.
It's set at 71 degrees and it's always on.
It's incredible.
And it's pulling out like literally gallons and gallons and gallons of water out of the air because he has all these instruments.
Mhm.
It's the only way that his instruments can stay fresh.
I feel like this style of architecture, to segue into some old world stuff, is again not new. We're looking at, like I said, the Capitol building in Austin yesterday, and it's like, okay,
incredible.
Yeah, but you brought up the idea that these structures were built by our founding fathers. Yeah. I know you're being facetious there. So like obviously being facetious, but yeah, I don't even know where to start with this. I think I've heard you riff with Professor Longo, and I'm going to link this episode in the show notes too, because it's one of my favorite ones that you've done on the Byzantine Empire. But basically what you guys were laying out is that there's a lot of speculation and sort of truther-esque ideas on what Tartaria was, and it's all speculation, conjecture, right? But not that there aren't good ideas, but the point in saying that is, with the Byzantine Empire, we have like very clear examples of advanced like antiquitech, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, because when I was coming up, they told us that the Dark Ages was essentially like a scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Like literally, like people were just throwing muck at each other and everybody was dying, and there was like literally no reason to live, and like, why did it even happen? And like everything that the Romans had figured out was just lost for 1,000 years. But at the same time, that narrative is, oh, during that 1,000 years where there was literally like zero intellectual pursuit, like, you know, there was like, it was the darkest of dark.
Right.
You know, it had bookends of the Black Death, like all these things, right? Because people don't know there were two Black Deaths. There's one supposedly at the beginning of the Dark Ages and supposedly at the end of the Dark Ages. So that's the way I was conditioned. But there's this real weird anomaly. All the most beautiful buildings in the world were built then.
Weird.
It's a very weird anomaly.
Yeah, very peculiar.
Plus, within that narrative, we're told that there's this narrative of this burgeoning new nation where these 13 colonies decide to pick them up by their bootstraps and just face down those imperialist British people and all this stuff.
And all the savages, quote, on the other end, right?
Yeah, and then at the same time that they're fighting a two-front war and homesteading and being agrarian and wanting no big government at all, like they literally were like anti-federalists. Like they did not want big government. Like whatever we do, we don't have big government. But yet build the biggest government buildings in the world all uniformly while fighting a two-front war, while growing their food. Like these men make me look like terrible. Like I think I get a lot done. I can't run a farm and run my construction company and raise my children and be a good father. Like to the extent that these men did it. Like these men, they had that good old grit, you know, like a good old American grit.
Right.
It's a lie.
Yeah.
It's a total lie. And where this really started to hit home, I always had questions about like I had questions because the cathedrals, especially when I went to go see them in person, it's another thing. It's like this awe-inspiring thing.
Dude, totally resonate with that, especially like when I lived in Germany for a little bit, the Kölner Dome in Cologne, Germany.
Oh,
like, my God, man, like they're like,
it's another consciousness.
Literally.
It's another consciousness. Anybody that's done any work on themselves, when you walk into a resonant building, you're like, like all the bells and whistles start to go off in your system.
Yeah.
That's not built by wage slaves.
No.
That is not built by people that are just doing this thing.
Yeah.
And also when I was a little kid going on the dome theme, you know, as every, you know, middle school kid does, they take a field trip to like, you know, the state capital. And then we went to Washington, D.C., and we got to walk through the Library of Congress. And I was like, being a little 12-year-old, I'm walking around and I'm like, this is magnificent. This is like, and these buildings are so massive and huge, and like the pillars are all like this wide. And I'm just like, and my dad's a builder, and my dad is like in the current day and age, like trying to build these 40, 50-story buildings, or back in those days in Florida, it was 30 stories, 35 stories was like the max. But like, they didn't have, in current day, they didn't have columns and marble like this. Like, this is like, how did they do that?
Mhm.
So it wasn't until like the mud flood stuff started to hit my consciousness in like 2017. And I'd already been over to Europe, and I had an extensive run in Scotland. I did a couple of retreats there. I was teaching there. And I had befriended a couple of like locals in the Edinburgh area, and they took me on a pub crawl one night. And all these pubs, what was weird was they were all in basements, but there were windows where the road was like going down at an angle. And I was just like, this is right before the mud flood stuff came to me. And I was like,
Why would they have built windows
why
here?
would you build a window
Right.
like that?
Right.
Like, I understand basement ventilation. Like,
Right.
and I have all, like, there's all these people like, oh, it's ventilation. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
You don't build window casements like every other window casement, have them all be equal,
Right.
and then have the angling of the earth go like literally
Cut off the windows,
in
essentially.
a non-asymmetrical way. Like,
Yeah.
you wouldn't do that. I remember talking to the owner of the one bar, and I was looking at it, and I was just like, do you have like problem with like water intrusion, because it rains a lot over there? And I've been living in Costa Rica, so I'm always about water mitigation.
Yeah.
I'm like, how do you get water away? That's poor form to literally have like an angling of earth coming towards a window, in a very rainy area. Like,
Yeah.
I would never do that as a builder. He's like, all the time, in his Scottish accent, he was like, yeah, it's a nightmare. Like, we're always having to like, suck water out and reseal and redo. And I was just like, and that was just in the back of my mind. I was like, because you see these incredible buildings.
Right.
You see these like, like in downtown Edinburgh, like there's these massive like pillars, and like just not pillars, like they have these like they're like these installations of these clocks outside of what the original castle was. And God knows when those were built. And they're like this black metal and black masonry, and they're perfect. And their alignment, you could go stand in one tower and look at the other one, and like you could see they all have perfect alignment. So you'd have that, but at the same time, you just walk right down the street to a pub, and you have a road that's like cutting through, like, I'm like, something's off,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So the mud flood hits the scene. And for those of you out there that haven't heard about that, nobody knows what caused the mud flood.
Yeah.
But funny enough is I had experience in Costa Rica watching liquefaction occur. So-
Real quick before we get there, because just to set what the mud flood is, it's this idea that if you look at buildings really across the earth,
Yes.
there's lots of evidence, kind of what Topher is indicating here, that the buildings go much further down, and people will claim, like with this pub, that it's the basement, but there's been countless examples of like modern building structures washing away, or as they're doing construction somewhere, they find literal like cityscapes
Yes.
completely underneath the ground. And it's like, who built those and why? And it's all across the earth. So
Right.
the mud flood is this idea that there were already advanced structures built that by someone, right?
Mhm.
That have now been built upon because this mud flood happened in.
Well, that's not the full mud flood theory. So I think that's partial. That's a good explanation, because that is true. Pretty much every major city that we know of on the earth was built on the bones of an older city.
Mhm.
What this is that there was obviously something that we could say was built within the last 1,000 years. Okay. That some natural, well, I won't even call it natural, because actually there's theories out there that it's not natural. There was some sort of earth-moving event that essentially took away a few stories of buildings. On average, it's up to 3 stories of buildings. And when we're told that photography started, which is in the mid-1800s, there's a bunch of different phenomenon that you see in the pictures. Okay. The first phenomenon that you see is like you have these big, beautiful buildings, but all the roads are dirt. Now, I'm a builder, and I build with all different weights of material. The one thing that you cannot do is bring in heavy material if all you have is a dirt road.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, the very first thing that you have to do when you're doing a development is set your roads up. And the roads have to like be able to handle heavy trucks. Okay, heavy trucks. So now we're getting back to the narrative that we originally talked about. We're told that our forefather settlers, not only were they fighting a 2-front war, they were learning a new environment that they weren't used to. They were raising families, writing laws, doing all this stuff. Not only they were doing that, they were building the heaviest buildings in the world. That to this day, if you were trying to deconstruct these buildings, you would go bankrupt because they were so overbuilt. My friend Paul Stobbs from Understanding Conspiracies, he used the term overbuilt. And the second he said that, I was like, ding!
Built to withstand everything.
Built to withstand what? They knew that this was going to happen.
Okay, got it.
They knew that there was going to be an earth-shaking event because there are plenty of ancient writings that said there will be a shaking. There will be an absolute shaking of the earth. So these buildings were built to withstand a lot. And they did. They did it admirably. Because we had already talked about, like, in modern building practices, you only get enough money to build something that will last a certain period of time.
Right.
Well, what's weird is these buildings that we're told are this Greco-Roman style, Nouveau Roman, however you want to term it. They all kind of big pillars, huge walls, way overbuilt. They're on every continent of the planet.
Convenient Jesuit narrative there.
Yeah. They're like in Asia, like in World War II, the area that the United States firebombed out of existence. Guess what they firebombed? They firebombed all these Greco-Roman buildings in Japan. I didn't know the Greeks and the Romans were hanging out with the Japanese, the Empire of the Sun. China, they did the same thing. All the different things that occurred in Russia with the Bolsheviks and all this stuff. What were they getting rid of? Dude, it's happened everywhere. Even in like South Africa and like areas like we were told, just recently been colonized and stuff like that. Recently, I'm saying like within, a few thousand years, you're finding these massive, massive buildings that are all built with a similar technique, are almost built to perfection, and they're overbuilt. Now, in North America, what we know from these pictures in the mid-1800s was essentially what you see in the first photographic evidence that we have is they whited out the sky. They did have their form of Photoshop back then, so they were obviously taking stuff out of the background. But universally, the roads, you would see a few carriages with horses. You would see the imprints of the horse hooves, and you would see tracks from the wheels of all whatever they were pulling, right? How did you build these buildings that would be heavy on today's standards? Like so heavy that you wouldn't build it. You couldn't afford to build it. Not only that, but we're told a narrative where we were anti-federalist. So you're telling me we fought the Revolutionary War in 1776, where we're going to be independent. But yet we build a second Rome that, in fact, Washington, D.C. was called Rome.
Mm.
Like, a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that Mississippi was called the Nile. There's so many things here that, like, when you look at it, the physical evidence, like I'm where the rubber meets the road guy. And ever since I started building, like, all these other things just like started to like pop up and being like, this just does not fit.
Mm.
This wouldn't happen this way. You wouldn't have dirt passageways if you're building these massive buildings. Another thing, and then I've gotten into, like, you know, these really good intellectual jostles with like people that are like, well, there were building guilds and there were this. I'm like, I know there were. I know I come from dignified roots. The Gardner side of my family, they owned mills, they owned foundries, lumber, all that stuff. I totally know that. And the narrative is incorrect. That narrative does not work. There are not enough hours in the day. There wasn't enough people. Like, you'd have towns and cities like Duluth, Minnesota, that would have like 180 people in it, and yet they want to build a 4-story city hall with a dome out of marble. What 180 guys would you know ever like be like, you know what? The first thing I do when I have free time, I'm going to go build a city hall.
Right.
Now, I guess we're just not cut from the same stock. I guess we're just like lame. But that's my point, is like, after, like, come on, guys, like, human nature wise, what's more probable? What's more probable is like history is written by the winners.
Right.
History is a lie agreed upon.
Right.
And the narrative that we're told is that, you know, all we've been doing since day one is fighting and killing each other forever and ever and ever, which statistically, if that was the truth, none of us would be here.
Right.
That's not the truth. Then we're told we are the most advanced people ever. Like, we're the best. I'm king of the hill. Incorrect. No. You can just look at the architecture, and you and I have been in these buildings. Tell me what current building as of, like, you know, let's say 2010 on, that's been built that you walk into and you're like feeling the awe that you feel walking into that German cathedral.
None. Zero. They look cool sometimes, but it's not like invoking or inciting a feeling of like awe,
right.
Beauty, you know?
Right. And so my feeling is that this is an inversion.
Yeah.
There's enough that I learned in the Eastern mysticism that I was, you know, into for long enough. And then the Christian mysticism that I've been into for long enough that you know, usually the story that we're told is an inversion.
Yeah.
And I'm very confident with the actual physical evidence that we have that is true. And then I also have met some Satanists. You know, I've met, you know, people that like claim to be Satanists and things like that. And I'm not saying this is all satanic, by the way. But what I've noticed that the Satanists that I've met, what they love to do is they love to mock.
Mm-hmm.
Out of any group of people I've ever met, that's what they love the most, is they love to come from an air of intellectual superiority, and that they're mocking you, that you're just so dumb, you don't even know what we're showing you. Ha ha ha, you know, this, like, you know, D&D, I'm wearing my cape. Look how, like, it's just so lame, right?
Right.
And have you ever watched My Lunch Break?
Huh.
It's a great channel. He does these like 20-minute videos every week. And he found the algorithm by which they've written history, especially when it comes to structures. It's hilarious when you see the algorithm. They're actually so lazy. Because part of the
repeating stories, right?
They repeat the story, and like they literally will just change a couple letters in each name amongst the people that designed it and built it. And then they will always say, it's like a code. This building was built in 1 year. This building was built in 4 years. Like the longest, like the biggest building ever, I think ever built with masonry stuff was in Chicago for the World's Fair. which used to be called Chicago, 500,000 square feet. Okay, 500,000 square feet. And they were just building it for a World Fair.
Right.
And, I just did a pod with JT Follows JC, and he's so funny because his father was a lath mason. And for those of you that don't know what lath is, like this wooden ribbing that you see right here, if you were to use this wooden ribbing as essentially an armature and then squeeze like a lime-based medium or a cement-based medium through it, that wooden lath would hold that in place. So we're told the Chicago's World Fair, the St. Louis World Fair, the Louisiana World's Fair, all these World's Fair with these most magnificent buildings. People will make the argument, they could build it so fast because it was lath construction.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, lath takes a lot of time and it's super heavy. You're saying that's your argument to say that they could do that fast.
Dude, even reading the Wikipedia pages, like especially on, I think, the Buffalo or Rochester World's Fair, just the Wikipedia pages.
Yeah.
You put any normal person that's totally bought into the conventional narrative and just have them read the Wikipedia page for the Buffalo World Fair. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
Literally impossible. Impossible.
What we're told about Niagara Falls and just the waterworks on the east coast of the United States, like the Erie Canal, like the way the Erie Canal works.
Yeah.
And we're told, a bunch of dudes dug that like over I think it was like a 12-year period of time. No,
impossible.
That's not the way. That's not how it occurred.
Yeah.
Because you could watch mega superstructures on Discovery Channel right now. And with the most current of the art technology where they're sucking water out, they're putting in false pillars to bring in more material to compact and do all this. I think in Japan, they built an airport that they finished, I think, like 10 or 15 years ago. And they had to build a false island that was essentially, I think, 3 kilometers long, this false island. And even that false island with all the most current tech in the Bay of Tokyo, that island they knew was going to sink 4 inches per year. And that they would only have use of that island with the most current tech for at most 30 years. But it was worth it. Like, could get that much more air traffic into Japan. It was worth the investment, even though they knew it was going to sink. We are talking about star forts. We are talking about things that are so magnificent in their construction on waterways that have not lost a single inch to the ocean.
Yeah.
And we're told that that's being built at the same time those people were fighting a two-front war.
Right.
Along with growing their own food. It wasn't like they could like roll up to McDonald's in the morning and get some food on their way to work.
Right.
They were all growing their own food. It wasn't like they even had tons of restaurants. They might have an inn that would have like, some bread and soup for whoever's staying at the inn. It wasn't like, no, the narrative that we're given is an absolute sham.
How do you make sense of, because I've wrestled with this quite a bit and maybe I just haven't looked enough, the narrative surrounding Native Americans and like nomadic tribes, or even tribes that were not nomadic and typically stayed in place. What's the truth? And we may not know. So I'd like to just hear your ideas on how those existed alongside these other spots in the United States that clearly were built and existing at the same time that Native Americans allegedly were on the
this is where the
plains.
Longo brothers have been enlightening me. Like Dr. Narcolongo has brought up to me a bunch of times that, especially when it came to the Cherokee Nation and also the Seminole Nation, the Seminole Nations never relented to the United States. They're their own nation.
Incredible.
And that's why in the state of Florida, they actually run the state of Florida.
Wow.
And the Seminoles, and this brings us back to like the Christian mysticism, the whole thing that has gotten me so excited as of late is because in the Seminole Nation, they have legend of Jesus Christ visiting them directly. So the narrative has been inverted. We've been told cowboys and Indians, we were all killing each other all the time. Whereas human nature And what we've seen in life is the truth of the matter is everybody mates with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been that way. And if you have good stuff to trade and you're not like stealing from me, we're going to bro out.
Yeah, we're homies.
We're homies.
Right.
Like people are good. I'm not whitewashing everything and saying that we're all have the best interest of everybody. But what I'm saying is it's not this, when you look at the Hollywood thrust of depicting nature and you look at what, at least the historical narrative I was brought up as, was that statistically, there would not be enough young men ever available to reproduce and have a population grow.
Mm-hmm.
Just with all the wars and conquest and like everything that the way we're told it happened. This is why the work of, I think, Anatoly Fomenko is so important, because he was the first person to bring to my consciousness that if history was as long as they say it is, recorded history, we would have a lot more people here, like a lot more, even given all the death and pestilence and all the rest of it, wars, all of it. We're like cockroaches. We breed. We just do. Like all this stuff we were told. And so how did the population, like, okay, so the way he is, for those of you out there that don't know, he was a statistician that worked for the Russian census. And so he was trying to get like accurate numbers of like, you know, how many people live in Russia. And then he was finding that there was too many inaccuracies with the math. And so he figured, oh, it must be an error of information. So he started to look through historical databases. Then he came to find that all this Russian history was essentially bottlenecked through Scaligierian Jesuits. And he's like, why are there English Jesuits writing about Russian history? Where's our Russian history?
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to go off on a huge tangent on that, but that is the case across the earth, pretty much, that it all bottlenecks to Jesuit.
Yeah. Through this, I think it's the scala, like I think in what we have now, like what the public, like if you're a Common Core student, like the trickle down of information that we've gotten is pretty much through the scavengers. Yeah. And so he thought that was very odd, you know, and I'm being like very nice about that. And he's like, so either they added a lot of years to history, because another thing he did is like what my lunch break did, is he found the algorithm. He found how they would modify historical events and just hit repeat. You know, sort of like how NASA does with their photos of the globe. like we'll take this cloud formation and just hit repeat.
Right.
You know, it's very funny that way. It's there's nothing new under the sun. So he's like, literally, like, this is the same story, just they changed this, and this. My lunch break does that with the building things. He's like, it's literally, they use the same story. They just changed this variable, this variable, this variable. It's hilarious once you see it. It's a big joke. So he's like, he wanted to find out, like, really, what is our history? Now, I've only read 2 of his, like, 5, you know, works. Like, they're massive tomes, but I get the gist. The gist is things aren't as we've been told. And I actually started to study calendrics a lot back before 2012.
Mm-hmm.
When I was moving down to Costa Rica.
What is calendrics? Just
calendars.
Got it. Okay.
I had a bunch of friends that were like, oh, the end of the world's happening in 2012 and stuff like that. And so I had started to read a bunch of people because it was very, in my study in massage, it was tied to like the old Ayurvedic system where our body is the Mazzaroth. Mm. Our body is like, if you were to say those stars are out there, our body is the correspondence here. And that system didn't match the Gregorian system at all. And they did pretty much everything based on the month, which I thought was more elegant. Because if you have 13 times 28, that's 364, and you only have 1 day variance. and any of us have women in our life, like that's a real thing.
100%.
And so I got enamored with the Mayan cosmology because of that, because they have their two different Baktun systems and things like that. But they had these cycles that I found to be very, very elegant and more. I like the idea, and this is just my bias, and I understand that. I'm not saying that this is factual, that they would always have like a day out of time.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like, it's almost like a tithe
Yeah.
to Chronos.
You're talking about like the 364, 365, just one day off.
Yeah. But what was so cool when you saw that in their system is that actually demarcated perfectly epochs that we had gone through. And so I was like, whoa, this is really kind of cool when you graph this out. And I was really trying to talk a bunch of my friends off a ledge in like 2020, from 2010 to 2012, because everybody's like, the Mayan calendar's in it. I'm like, no, because I read all these people that were doing the real work, and they're like, the Gregorian calendar isn't correct. So even if this, like whoever paired the Gregorian calendar to the Mayan calendar, most of it was they didn't even mesh those two gears correctly. Mm-hmm. But then you actually had to ask the validity of the Gregorian calendar. And it was so obvious by like, I think John Major Jenkins and this Ian Lungold, that the Gregorian calendar was an utter farce. And so that was in my consciousness like a while back. And then I'm like finding out, and then I'm not a historian. Like didn't really study history all that much.
I'd argue that you kind of are now.
Now I am.
Yeah.
Because the thing about me I have to say is like, when I'm being lied to, when I was a little kid, when I was being lied to, I'd lose interest. But I didn't know that's what was happening. They were just saying, oh, you're just like, you're a bad student.
You have ADHD.
That, I was before that time. They would have
That's literally what they do now, though. ADHD, let's give you this psychotropic medication.
Yeah. Like one of my friends said, across the world, around the world, every day, kids are behind a fence being lied to. Mm-hmm. And then when you hear that, that's like so shocking.
100%. Yeah.
That is so shocking.
Yeah.
So my little self did not like that.
Yeah.
So here's the picture. We have a calendrix. It's just like the maps that we're given. We only know what we're told. Mm-hmm. Like, let's be honest.
Right.
We are told that this is the geographical space that we're on, and we're told this is the time that we live in. But yet everybody agrees history is agreed upon. Guys, this whole thing is different than what we thought. It's very, very different. I mean, your podcast like goes into like all the lies that industry is always telling us about everything. Mm-hmm. Like lying, the lie is the norm.
Yeah.
And that brought me to a spiritual way of looking at it. Is like, because there's this one passage in that John the Revelator says in Revelations where he's like, after the millennial reign of Christ, the deceiver, the accuser, will be loosed upon the nations to deceive them for a little while. Mm. And I'm like, everything I've ever been told that's worth anything has been a lie. Mm. And I have a spiritual, like I see this world as spiritual condensate. Mm-hmm. Like to me, matter is spiritual condensate. Like there isn't like, it's there and I'm here.
Right. Would you say like you're a naturalist, like a spiritual naturalist in that way almost?
I like the term natural philosopher.
Natural philosopher. Yeah.
I like that term a lot.
Yeah.
Because I do have a love for life. Like I do see the absolute importance for having form and body and function and all that. I'd been around enough new age people where they were so trying to escape their body.
Escape materialism.
Yeah. And saw how unhealthy that is and how it's a lie. It's actually not true.
Totally.
Because when you get to the other side of the veil, you see how many of those beings that are disincarnated want to be in a body.
Right.
They're all vying to be in a body. There's like a queue from here to eternity to like, I need a body.
Right.
So to be in a body and be so disenchanted with it that you're like, oh, it's about getting out of the body. I'm like, you got it backwards. Once again, there's an inversion going on.
Yeah.
It's
Totally.
it's such like to have the ability to actually work through, like you work out a lot. You're into fitness and conditioning. There's a thing called hormetic stress. And it's a stress that's beneficial, physically beneficial. Well, this world is like spiritually a hormetic stress for our soul. That's what it's here for. Like it is a stress, but it's making us better.
Yeah.
It's making us actually like get into the groove of the higher truth, you know? So I'm kind of leaning towards this whole notion of the little season being a real thing.
That's what I wanted to lead into next, actually, because I've seen a few videos. Let me back up. Let me preface this by saying two of my friends that I consider to be the most well-read, well-studied, if you want to call them amateur biblical scholars that I know, that are also two of the most critical, deepest thinkers that I know, like by far. Like I like the sharpest, most critically thinking people I know are preterists. And I don't feel that I'm well-versed enough to describe what preterism is, but I think you probably could too, because you tend to lean towards that as well.
Yeah, it makes too much sense. Because if you really read the Bible, and the Bible is or I will say this, the axiom, for those of you out there that don't know, the axiom of the Christian faith is the Bible. And they do not discount the Torah, which is the Old Testament. They actually see the prophecies that in the histrionics of the Torah as the book of remembrance, that as being very instrumental to the New Testament. And that's why they put them together. And the histrionics are very, very important, especially when you get into the extended histrionics, when you get into the extra canonical texts, which over the last 15 years, I've gotten to read 7 of I think it's 14 extra canonical texts that have been taken out. Absolutely earth-shattering to me. In fact, I never would have really left the Christian faith if I would have had those books to begin with. Because for as much as like Eastern mysticism and magical rites and shamanism and all this stuff gets like wants to like, dabble in the supernatural, nothing is more supernaturally pertinent to my life experience than what these extra canonical texts talk about. The Apocrypha for people that
can you give some names of some of the texts? Just
Second Esdras is probably the most pivotal. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Thomas. Like, I mean, you start with those 3, and with the Book of Enoch, I would just stick with the first Book of Enoch, because that first Book of Enoch is so dense. It's literally like, to me, the way I've termed it in my mind, it's literally like if you've ever played any type of game where you need a legend on the side to like that you can keep referring to, so that you know where you are in the game and who you're against and what their powers are or whatever. The Book of Enoch is literally the legend to the Bible.
Wow.
Like if you don't have the Book of Enoch,
you can't make sense of the Bible.
You can't make sense. Like I'll say I couldn't make sense of the Bible.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, I was warned away from the Book of Enoch.
It's interesting.
The Protestants in my life were like, no, that wasn't inspired.
Right.
So when I made my way back after Eastern mysticism back and like got the Book of Enoch and was reading it, I was like, oh, now that makes sense. Oh, now I know why when I thought God was just being like this tyrannical bastard and killing all these innocent people, like that's not what was happening at all. Those were pre-biblical giants. Like,
Yeah.
there's all this stuff that, like, unless you have the Book of Enoch, the legend of the Book of Enoch, like, you do not have any. I need to say it in first person. I did not have. There were too many contradictions in the Bible without that. That's the easiest way I could say that. The Book of Enoch is my legend for the Bible. And so the contradictions that I had originally couldn't resolve, especially when I was in college, reading the Bible and really trying to be a good Christian. And oddly enough, like a lot of the pastors that I was interacting with, Protestant pastors I was interacting with, they couldn't give me sufficient context and couldn't resolve that. And I didn't want to be a hypocrite, so going away and having my prodigal son moment of like coming back to it because I had some real life experiences with essentially demonic energies that were in clients of mine that I was doing body work on. And the only thing that would clear the space was the name of Jesus Christ.
Interesting point. So, doctor that we know that is a psychiatrist that you would not consider to be super woo. And the only reason I say that is because he would not be the type of person that would ever even typically entertain the type of stuff that we get into, right?
Yeah.
When he was a psychiatrist, I think either in some sort of mental ward or something like that, he witnessed over and over again the same thing, like invoking the name of Christ is what, in one case, I think he said this lady who would not speak.
Right.
Tried so many different things with her. And then the only thing that could get her to speak was expelling the demon by invoking the name of Christ.
Yeah. Demonic oppression is a real thing.
Yeah.
And so there's ailments that people have that are absolutely caused because there's a stronghold over the person. And I had a really good friend of mine, one of the muses I was telling you about, and she knew that she had it, but she couldn't get it. And at the time that I was working on her, I was working with we were doing essentially a tag team bodywork session where I was doing polarity therapy and the kinesiologist, she was doing her action at the same time. And the two of us watched this thing roll in her.
Wow.
It was like watching a tarpon roll in the water.
Whoa.
But it rolled right through her body. And then she started talking in tongues and doing all these things. And all my prana was we're in one of my domes, this gives me so many chills. So I had a healing dome and I did all my massage work for people that would come to me in it. Fully earth ground. I had a cob floor, bare feet, the entire thing. And I could say it was a true healing experience. Like no AC, no nothing, just fresh air, totally earthed. It was an earthen dome. It was complete ground. It was like walking into a man-made cave. Mm-hmm. And we're doing this session with her, and my partner Nicole was watching this, and we both look at each other, and the prana was running through me and it was running through her, and we just decided to keep going. And like an hour later, the session finishes and it had resolved. And I, under my breath, was saying, Jesus, you have all jurisdiction in this zone. Do what you need to do. And her, under her breath, she was doing the same thing, and it resolved. And neither of us were claiming to be Christian. Mm-hmm. Like I had just read Joseph Atwell's The Caesar's Messiah. Mm-hmm. Like I had been entertaining thoughts that Christ wasn't even a real being. Like
kind of like what Zeitgeist sort of frames Christ to be.
Like I've dabbled in those worlds. Right, like I've entertained it because I have an open mind. So like, hey, make an argument.
Right.
And so it's not like I'm a Bible thumping, like evangelical at all when this occurs. And it still worked. And then another friend of mine he wasn't a friend at the time. He ended up becoming a friend. He was my neighbor. And he was a Scientologist. And he was riddled, with some nasty stuff. And our other neighbor calls me over and is like, can you come help me out? I go over there and my neighbor is just like really going through it. And I just start praying, and it was like the scene. You haven't seen it yet, where Heath Ledger in the Batman movies. He's like, sir, like this other voice came through him, like this demonic voice, and I'm like praying, and he's like, God is dead to me, and he was just like, he was livid that I was. And then once at this time, I really called in Jesus because I had a little confidence. And I did the same anchoring. I was like, Jesus Christ, you have jurisdiction over this interaction in this land. Do what you will. And he cleared it. Gone.
Wow.
To the point where that man never even remembered that occurred.
No way. So he was fully in that moment, at least taken over.
He was possessed.
Yeah. Wow.
And I've dealt with enough I shouldn't say enough, because that makes it sound like it was a regular occurrence. On a few occurrences over a 20-year period of working on people, I would have what would be called a walk-in. And this would usually happen with a very specific body type and very specific polarity. And they were just very conducive to walk-ins, where they didn't know that their will was
being taken over by another entity.
By a completely other entity.
Mm.
And so I knew the difference between a walk-in and a full-on possession. Like, there's a huge difference.
What's the difference in presentation?
The possession, it's anti-Christ.
Okay.
And it's overtaking the person's will.
Got it.
The evil is when, you enforce your will upon another without their consent.
Yeah.
And possessions, it's the person didn't call that in.
Right.
And that's why I had a real problem with I ended up having, really extracting myself out of the New Age world. Because the all love and light people, you're missing a huge, you're missing the thing. There are beings that will take advantage of you in that realm. If you're acting as naive as you're acting, and you don't know the actual setting that you're in, you are just running. You're literally, like, as the Greeks would say, like, the fates are running you.
This is precisely why someone took issue on a recent episode that I did, where I said I'm skeptical of channeling, and like human design as an example. That's a channeled material, and I personally have utilized human design, and I know other people have, for a positive effect in their lives.
Yes.
And I can't say the characteristics and the constitution of the individual who channeled it, because I don't know them, but like the material itself, I've taken positive effect from. But the point is, while acknowledging that there may be benevolent examples of channeling, ultimately, especially for the unattuned individual and unaware individual, and someone who is very of the love and light mindset that there is no evil trying to infringe upon me, which is, as you're saying, I totally agree. That's how much of the New Age is. All these people claiming to channel, it just does not sit right with me, man. There's so many people that are claiming to. I'm just like, something is fucking off about that.
That was my claim to fame in the ashram.
Really?
So I could channel.
Really?
Yeah.
What do you think you were channeling?
I know for a fact that one of the channels I had brought in an absolute disembodied, like, the last time I did it, at the time I had a girlfriend that was dealing with the remnants of the sexual abuse of incest. And I was being taught a false teaching at the time, whereas the way you work through anything is you actually revisit it. Now, I was in my mid-20s. I was dumb.
That's what a lot of people in the trauma healing space say, by the way.
It's not true.
Yeah.
That's not the way you do it. I can't say 100%. There are much better ways to go about it.
Totally agree.
But at that time, that was what I was in, and that's what I believed to be true. And I was very, I guess you would say, I was running my prince archetype.
Got it.
You know, knew just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah. Kind of cavalier a little bit, though.
Very cavalier with it. So I decided to channel the perp, my girlfriend's uncle.
You made a decision to channel him.
I made the decision and run, at the time, we called it processing.
Oh, wow.
Where I would bring him into my conscious, I would bring him in, vector him in, so that she could confront him and be resolved. Horrible idea. Because he entered my body, and what was weird was this time, the consciousness, this being, did not want to leave. And I felt all of his desires, and I felt his lust for her. And I felt all of his, like, just his depravity. Like, that's why he was disembodied. Like, that was taken away because, and it was not leaving. And then he became aware of my will to have him leave and literally turned in me and said, no. And I was freaking out because I was only like halfway in control of my body when he was there. And my girlfriend at the time she saw like my facial expressions, everything shift. Because you see that a lot with schizophrenics. Like their eyes will change colors. They're like
whole facial expression. Like not even just facial expression. I'm talking about like facial features. Seem, dude, it is. I've seen it. I've seen it in person.
I've seen it too.
Yeah, it's
and like that was happening to me, and I could feel it internally. But what was so scary to me was I didn't have agency over my body. There had never been a time before where I didn't have agency. And so like I literally called on the guru. Like I went and banged on the door and I told him what I was doing and what was happening, and like essentially asked for like a soul retrieval in that point. Because it was a trauma for me, and that vacuous space that I had created to allow this other thing to come in, it left some tentacles, like it left some hooks. Like it did end up leaving, like it did end up getting extracted.
You could say maybe left some scars then rather than hooks.
Yeah, like I can never, because in my own life, I never ever had any of that type of energetics in my system. And now I did. And it was like, whoa, it's not
me.
And from age 28 on, I was just like, you're not to do that.
Right.
The lesson for me was just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. Like I could do that. You know, as somebody that had near-death experiences, it was just like, oh, I know my body is just an aspect of me. It's not all of me. Like, and yeah, my attention and awareness are not, the locus is not necessarily the body. So I could do that easily. But the thing is just like nature abhors a vacuum. You create a vacuum through will, because it was through willpower. I have to admit, like I was doing it from an egotistical perspective. I wasn't doing it from a clean, this is God's will perspective. This was my will. I'm going to fix her. She's going to see me as a savior. And that made me susceptible to that lower energy form. So I've never done it since then.
Wow. I mean, that's validating to hear. Hear. And it sort of reaffirms that like, okay, yes, channeling is a real phenomenon. People absolutely are channeling things, but it like begs the question, what are you channeling? And just because the message at first, and I don't mean this to strike fear in people or even people who've read channeled materials, because I've read a few of them, and the ones that I've read thus far have impacted me in a positive way and have led me to the positions that I'm at right now, which are very much in alignment with where you're at, which I look up to you, so that says a lot, right? But just because you're channeling something that is coming across in a good way right now doesn't mean that there isn't some trickery at the end and some distortion in the message. And all that to say, I think we need to be very wary of both the action itself for those who partake in it and also of listening to people who are doing it.
Well, that's another thing I found out, because I gave up channeling, but then I ended up being in a community where there was a lot of psychedelics. And I partook in the psychedelic world for about 10 years. Like, and my very closest friend down in Costa Rica, like, he was an actual shaman, was inducted into the Shipibo tribe and all this stuff. And like, he has the best of intentions. Like, I've known him forever. I know where his heart is. Like, he's a benevolent alpha. Like, he really wants the best for people. And so his ceremonies were what I partook in. I partook in a couple other people's, and it was not the same.
Right.
But what I started to notice near the end of my career with ayahuasca specifically was that the field that's created when you have an array of people that alter their consciousness, it's just like an antenna array. And that can be populated with synthetic thoughts. That can be populated with synthetic notions. We were literally having this really intense ceremony, and I took a lot personally. I don't know. I'm pretty sure a lot of people had taken a lot. The weather was being really, really weird, and we were all kind of going through it. And then, like, midway through the third cup, I became hyper aware that I'm listening to United Nations propaganda. And then I had like 3 different people come up to me, and they start talking to me about this UN propaganda. And it was essentially the whole alien agenda stuff. And I'm like I'm hearing it. Like, I'm hearing it like listening to a podcast. And then each one of these people are coming to me like they're having an authentic experience of it. And then I had the whole, because I've studied because of the Orgone accumulators and radionics and all that. I know you can broadcast a signal at those wavelengths. Because whenever you become an antenna array, you're a receiver.
Right.
And so if you know the frequency range of the brain,
what ayahuasca induces in the brain, essentially,
right, and then you have an antenna array, and you know the location of it, you can broadcast a signal.
That is crazy to think about. That's crazy
because we're receivers,
right?
Ta-da! And I was like, and I went to the shaman, like, I was all happy. I was like, dude, and I'm like. And I started talking about like the UFOs and the aliens. He's like, yeah, I know. I'm like, no. It's a broadcast. I'm like, this is a broadcast. This isn't real. And nobody wanted to hear it because what I noticed is the cult of ayahuasca, or the cult of whatever you idolize. You want to believe because it's novel to you and that you're doing something in a non-ordinary reality, you want to think it's true. But the problem is when you do that, when you go into those areas where your prefrontal cortex is shut down like that, you don't have any boundary layers. And so those thoughts, they're being incepted into you.
Do you think that's true in every case with ayahuasca?
Not every case.
Yeah. Like, did you have any positive experiences?
I had tons of positive. But what I was noticing, I was being very specific with my verbiage, was that this happened. This whole thing was occurring. The timing wasn't right. Because like, I think like these higher, like, I don't think you can induce genius. Like what I've experienced when it comes to genius, or what people will call the zone, like as an athlete, like when you just do something as perfectly as you could possibly do it, but you didn't do it. It happened through you.
That's when you get into like the an egoless
Exactly.
state. I mean, that's like what, like Kobe and Phil Jackson, like that's what Kobe would indicate is that it's like, it's an egoless state.
It totally is. Yeah. And it's such a quandary for athletes because you get most of the praise for those moments that you weren't there doing it.
Right.
It was happening through you.
Right.
And so that's like that's the funniest thing, you know? And so that's kind of like what sent me on my quest into spirituality was like, how come I perform the best when I'm not doing it?
Yeah.
Like, why? What is that? And then learning about, I read Stephen Kotler's book, what is it called? Engineering Superman, how to get into the flow state, all those books. I love all that stuff because, there's many different venues of my life where I've experienced that. But the core experience is there isn't an I, me, mine while that's occurring. Mm-hmm. It's just happening. And it's the same thing with a near-death experience. Like, it's not happening to you. It's just happening.
Right. Interesting on that. I interviewed in episode 4 of my podcast, this guy named Vinny Tolman, who had an after-death experience, which is a subset of near-death experience community that like they're legally pronounced dead. He was zipped up in a body bag, all that.
Wow.
I got to send you that. The whole episode is incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. But immediately when he ejects from his body and he's watching it from above, he's hearing thoughts of other people like in the room coming around him. He has no idea that the scene that he's witnessing is him.
Right.
No clue for like hours until he was finally approached by someone else after they finally like revived the body. That whole story of how they even got to the point of reviving the body after zipping up in a body bag is incredible. But the point is, it took forever for him to finally realize, like, oh, that's me.
Yeah.
Like he had total disattachment from that being him.
Yeah. No, it's a thing. It's totally a thing. It's just like, oh, that's happening. Oh, wait a minute. That's supposed to be me. I'm the narrator of this story.
Right.
Yeah. It's a
You've
thing.
had a near-death experience?
Yeah.
Wow. You mentioned that a couple of times.
Yeah, I was really little. So,
okay.
I was 4. I mean, I remember it. Yeah. But that's why I've always had questions about reincarnation, because when I was in the other plane, I was that age. I wasn't like an old soul.
Uh-huh.
So it was always like a mystery to me because I always had all these people because I was a Pisces and they were like, you're an old soul. You're an old soul. And I'm like, actually, I'm not. Like when I was on the other side, I was that age.
So what do you think about reincarnation after
I totally believe in it.
Yeah.
I just don't have any direct experience.
Yeah. And remember I was asking yesterday, like, I talked to Brendan Murphy about this, and I think about this frequently, right? Because I think we have countless examples across the earth of people, like a little kid born in Japan remembering very specific things of like some time in England, and then you're able to actually trace back those exact things, the people around, the street that he lived on, all those things, right? And countless examples of this. But could it be that you're sort of identifying with some sort of thread that you're picking up in the ether and then attributing it to you and your current state right now, thinking that this, whatever thread you're attached to, means that that's the life that you lived?
I think that's closer to reality.
Okay.
Because that's getting back to our conversation on resonance.
Yeah.
You go into resonance like a tuning fork. If your shape of your form, the location of your body, and all these things end up having a resonant pattern with something at some other point in time, space, and whatever, it doesn't matter. If they're resonant with each other, it's going to be this synergistic. I forgot to finish the whole thing on a dynamic disequilibrium.
Yeah.
But, Eileen Mikuza calls it syntropy.
Yeah.
When you have syntropy, there's no distance. So you could misidentify with something that you're in resonance with as it being you.
Right. And that's how Eileen's able to tune virtually, right? Because of syntropy, essentially.
Yeah. And space and time don't matter. Like you can do retrocausal healings, which really freak people out. Like when you do retrocausal work.
Joe Dispenza talks about, and I have some questions around some of the stuff that he does, but in this instance, there's this study done where he had people pray, or whoever's conducting the study had people pray for a subset of people in a hospital. And then the other subset of people were not prayed for. The people in the study didn't realize they were praying for people like 10 to 15 years back. And they were actually like pretty significant. I don't know what the p-value was, but it's pretty significant results. The subset of people that were prayed over, despite it being 10 to 15 years back, had better outcomes than the ones who weren't prayed over, despite the praying actually happening in the future.
Right.
Wow.
I've had totally direct experiences with retrocausal healing. Like doing shadow work retrocausally and then coming across that person, and they are completely different in real time. Like there is like the whole thing with time as being this linear thing. Yeah, for the most part, but not really.
Yeah.
Like I've been fascinated with the Mandela effect and retrocausality because I think part of what people are experiencing with the Mandela effect is the fact that there are enough souls out there that are doing retrocausal work. And there's obviously, the big ticket agencies out there, they are also doing retrocausal work.
Right.
But now we're actually seeing the evidence of it. Now you're seeing whole swaths of people that are just like, no, that didn't happen that way. It happened this way.
Well, we were talking about yesterday, like the countless examples in the Bible.
The Bible thing is crazy because even in the Bible, I think it's Daniel, he prophesizes in it that there, at the end of this epic, of the age of Abraham, you will have to have the Bible written on your heart because God allows the word to change. So, like, I deal with literalists a lot of time that look at the Bible and they're like, this is inspired and this is the word. And they they're living it more like a Leviticus Jew than like a Christian that has, forgiveness in their heart.
Right.
They're like following it to the letter. And I'm like, but in your own book, it says that the word's going to change. Like it says it. And look, you remember things differently. Like you remember the Lord's Prayer being this. You remember the lion with the lamb. You remember this and this. Like it's not about like following every little specific thing because literally Jesus said, you're in this world, but you're not of it. Well, aren't these words in this world? It's not about that. It's about the spirit of it. It's about what does the actual spirit of being in jurisdiction with your creator, what does that actually do?
And the examples you were bringing up, you're talking about like how in the Lord's Prayer, we all remember it, virtually all of us remember it as trespass, but now it's debtor.
Yeah.
And then lion and the lamb versus now I think it's wolf and the lion.
Wolf.
Yeah, wolf and the lamb or something like that. But the point that you're getting to with the Mandela effect, with the text changing and us having this collective experience of like, no, it's not that, of the difference between being a literalist and having it on our heart. It makes sense how many of us, like even my wife and I, over the past year and a half, are finding ourselves dipping our toe back into Christianity. Like, because I grew up an evangelical Christian, then completely rejected it for some time, and now kind of like you, am coming back around. But like we went to this evangelical church that was local, and it was like, okay, we love the worship because no matter what, we can frame it as this is a bunch of people singing in reverence to God, and that feels good. And some of the sermons, it's like, okay, this doesn't match with like what feels true about what Christ is and his teaching, but okay. And then there is sometimes the sermon we would be like, does the pastor even know the depth of what he's saying? Because like what he's saying is so incredible. But all that to say, it makes sense on what you're bringing up about what was written in the book of Daniel, or was it in the book of Daniel? Or
I think it was.
Yeah, where that it will be written on your heart, because it's like the Bible literalists, I don't jive with that, at least in how it's interpreted in mass, at least like the agreed upon approaches, no matter the denomination. It just seems off. There's pieces missing. There's fundamental pieces missing, fundamental incongruencies. But it's like,
which gets back to the legend that I talked about with the book of Enoch and Second Ezra's and all of that.
Yeah.
Like it literally gets back to that, because that's why I've had these really heartfelt conversations with biblical literalists, I'm like, do you know in 1850 there were 80 books of the Bible, not 66? Do you know if you go to Ethiopia right now, which is the longest held Christian tradition in the world, the longest held, they have 92 books?
I have the Ethiopian Bible on my coffee table at home.
It's just like,
Yeah.
So when you say you're biblically literate, you're only like kind of biblically literate because you haven't actually,
right.
When you say like the Bible is the word and the word is God and all this stuff, well, come on, let's get with it. And this brings us all back to like, these buildings were overbuilt. This gets us back to this history is a lie agreed upon that we're talking about. This gets us back to this little season notion of like, okay, we're given a very, very neutered spirituality in today's world. You and I both have had these prodigal son moments where we had to leave the churches that we're in because there was no real juice.
No.
They're not actually invigorating their congregations. They're actually taking from their congregations. And you can't tell me that that's the same consciousness of the consciousness that built those frickin' buildings. You get a bunch of people that are invigorated to build these beautiful, just like overbuilt, we're told that they're Capitol buildings. Who even knows what their purpose was? Built these buildings that were built to last, whatever was to come. That was a Christ consciousness.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to like share with people is like, if you have any building experience at all, the stories don't make sense. If you have any experience with spirituality at all, and then you're sensitive enough and have had the opportunity to go into some of these buildings, you know what it's doing to your system.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a slave consciousness. That's a Christ consciousness. That's like you're in this world, but you're not of it. This is what you are capable of in my name. And in my name is just like, once again, people don't actually read what Jesus said himself. Like what he was saying himself wasn't follow me only. I'm the only begotten son. If he was that pompous, he wouldn't have started the Lord's Prayer with our Father.
Mm-hmm.
He would have said, my Father.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Lord's Prayer, like when his disciples are like, how should we pray to the Almighty Father? Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It's an our affair. So that's why I'm under the impression, and I'm saying it's an impression, because like I'm always like fielding new information and stuff like that. But I'm just looking at this beautiful ramp up that's occurred since the flat earth came, and then all this information on revisionist history. Then you come into the mud flood energetics of things, and then you like there's so much of it. It's like culminating in this.
Yeah, because where does it lead? What does it mean to? What's the so what about it? Other than just like, okay, history is a lie. Right.
To me, it's a spiritual affair. We're back into the spiritual, like the physical world is a spiritual condensate.
Yeah.
Like this is the plane of inertia.
Mm-hmm.
And so like when I talk, just like you'll have your biblical literalists, you'll have your flat earth literalists, and they want to make everything so material.
Yeah.
And my point is like, you can't have things be so material, especially if you can do retrocausal work.
Yeah.
Tell me in a materialist paradigm how retrocausal work can even be a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It can't. It cannot. But there's literally texts that are thousands of years old that talk about retrocausal work. It's because this that appears fixed and fixated and has inertia, it doesn't want to change. That's what inertia is. It's so temporary. It's temporal. Mm. That which is temporal, by definition, is not real. Mm. This isn't the reality. We're here and we have the experience. It's like, whoa, we have a continuity that we call a soul. And we're like, oh, yay, material, da, 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 da. But in reality, the eternal is reality. And I think the real prodigal son moment or prodigal daughter, prodigal being moment is where, this is God's will that's playing out. So be it. I'm in it, but I'm not of it.
Mm.
I'm the eternal witnessing awareness. You know? And then like your whole attitude changes. So you might be having the same, objective experience from the materialist perspective, but now you are subjectively in heaven.
Yeah.
You're subjectively like your whole thing is clean.
Mm-hmm.
It's just clean. You're just like, and cleanliness is close to godliness. It really is. But it's not material cleanliness.
No.
It's literally like, my attitude, there's like no residue. Whatever experience I'm having, there's no real residue.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh yeah, cool. But obviously if God didn't want this to happen, how did it happen?
Right.
And so that's like those are like the philosophical waters that I've been swimming in as of late.
Damn. I love that so much.
Yeah.
I want to circle back on one more point on preterism real quick. And you're talking yesterday, the evidence that like the second temple falling already happened.
Yeah, the second temple.
I want to preface this by saying that a lot of my family members are Christian of some type, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're perpetually waiting for the rapture to occur.
Yes.
And they're buying into what I would now consider personally, and again, I'm always open to changing my mind too, to be a psyop of sorts that is being played on Christians across the world right now, where they're totally cool with the world going to shit because it's like, it doesn't really matter. Jesus is coming back. And I'm not going to say that's all Christians that buy into that do also buy into the rapture, but I see it in my own Instagram comments. Mm-hmm. I see it in other people's Instagram comments where it's like, none of this matters anyway. We're all like, the earth is going to go to shit and Christ is going to come back to save us.
Mm-hmm. It's like a nihilist. It's like a nihilism with like a little bright light
right
at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
Yeah. And then usually there's some superiority mixed in there with that.
Totally.
Like we're special.
Totally.
Yeah. I've interacted with a lot of that energy, and I do part of my love of, because preterism, just so you know, I'm not a full preterist.
Mm-hmm. No, I wasn't assuming that you were.
No, I know. I just want to qualify for people that are listening, because people will go and like look up what does preterism mean. I've done a few podcasts on it, and like they'll go into preterism and it's like, oh, the Bible has been fully fulfilled. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I want to make a few qualifications. One, I think the Bible is a holographic text. So there's multiple ways that anything can be interpreted. Mm-hmm. When something is holographic, it's fractal. That means you can go forward and backward in time. You can go in any X, Y, Z.
Even like micro to macro, because like how some people will say the Bible is an allegory for the human body. And it's like, oh, that's true. But then it also could be, I mean, it really is a brilliant text if that is true. If it is a holographic text, as you're saying, it is brilliant. But it's so tough because I don't want to go off on too many tangents. I think you kind of already indicated this. Do you agree that the Bible has been subject to possible manipulation?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But it's still the holographic nature of it still bleeds through despite the manipulation of man.
Because I really think this whole thing, like all of life, is just a shit test to see whether or not you idolize things of this world.
Material. Yeah.
Well, people will idolize the Bible.
Yeah.
Whereas so I know just enough to be dangerous with people. So if somebody's really coming me hard and fast with like the old, like the New Testament stuff, and And like, I'll reference things to the Old Testament and vice versa and be like, okay, like you can't, the way that you're interpreting this is too literal and it's too linear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is a holographic teaching. It can be actually experienced in so many different domains, in so many different directions, that you kind of have to like let go of your idolship.
Mm.
Like the world is like letting go of idolship. We have a beginning, middle, and end. We do. Like at the idolizing of the body will have to be let go.
Mm-hmm.
You talk to any older person and they'll tell you by the time they've reached the third phase of their life, it's all about learning how to let go.
And that's where it's like the dance of, you don't want to buy into the new age belief of wanting to transcend physicality and transcend the body. You want to be fully in love with this experience, but not idolizing it. There's like
you're in this world, but you're not of it.
Literally. Right. Yeah. And you're fully in this world, experiencing it, loving it.
You're fully experiencing it. You're going through all the subjective emotions.
Right.
You fully experience it.
Yeah.
And then you're like the perfect avatar for God experiencing his creation.
Yeah.
Because the way I see it is like, because I was told this by evangelicals when I was a kid. God is omnipresent and omnipotent, and everything has been written. Everything that shall occur will occur, blah. And they were like coming at it. And then the way my little mind thought of it as a kid was like, God is just watching a rerun? Like I knew as a little kid, I hated reruns.
Yeah.
And so I was like, God did all this as a rerun? Like that's where my mind went.
Mm.
And now the way I see it is when I understand how subjectivity works and free will works is God could know objectively everything that is going to happen. Like he could know, like he knows the plan. But he gets to have you like this incredible potpourri of different subjective viewpoints of his creation. Be like, I never knew Topher would see it that way. Ah!
Right.
Like
that's the whole point of the veil of forgetting. God like imbuing himself with, or imbuing pieces of himself with his consciousness, but under a veil.
But this is why I like Christianity.
Okay.
And this is the difference between Christianity and every other monistic thought process that's out there, is that Christianity is the only one that says you were designed specifically as you are, and God has a personal relationship with you. It's the only one. And I've looked, man. Whether you're a Taoist, like you can just go down the list of Eastern mysticism. It's all about the impersonal life. Mm-hmm. It's all about how you're just part of, like you made the qualification between like, you know, being one with God and God is one with all. Like that's a huge qualification. Like that's the full Monty.
Right.
Okay. The reason why I have my preference set and my bias towards Christianity is I know for certain that each one of us are unique.
Mm-hmm.
I've never looked at two sets of charts. I've never worked on two bodies. I've never met anybody that's like anybody else.
Yeah.
I know twins that are literally soul splits. They know that they're the same soul split. They're still totally different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes sense because the Bible starts off with, you know, in the beginning was Logos.
Mm-hmm.
That means that there was order.
Yeah.
There's perfect order. Perfect. The chaos and the shenanigans is only from lack of reference. It's just because your exposure isn't broad enough. It's actually all in perfect order. There's never been a fight between, you know, the devil and God ever. No, the devil loves God. He hates the fact that God loved us so much that he would have a personal relationship with us.
Mm.
Like he wants to know, like he's biting at the bit to know what Alex Zek is going to think of such and such. He doesn't know. He gave you free will.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, he's going to have an interview with that dude. I can't wait to see what the, like.
Right.
Because think about it, the Almighty, the Almighty, like really like let like infinity, these terms like eternity, infinity, omnipresence, and omnipotent. You really think that's going to resolve into somebody that's a bean counter that doesn't want to like actually experience newness?
Right.
To me, that's a very, very narrow way of thinking.
Totally agree. Okay, back to the Second Temple, that thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is all new to me when it comes to learning about the real history. But I cannot, like, I'm terrible with like quoting like scripture, like, you know, Jeremiah, whatever. Like, I can't do that.
Right.
Like, that's not the way my mind works. But the gist of it is this, is that the temple that the Jews, you know, that they had erected, I forget under which epic, that gets destroyed in the exact time frame that the Bible states would happen during tribulation.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, all the prophecy of tribulation is completely and utterly, fully completed by 70 AD.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of it.
Yep. And we're talking that, again, the context is modern Christians overwhelmingly think that that's still to come.
Yeah, they're thinking like the third temple is going to be built, where there's a mosque now in Jerusalem. They think that, okay, all the stuff, the shenanigans that are going on over there right now, in the red heifers that were, you know, from here in Texas, brought over there. And, you know, it's kind of funny because I've run with cats that really think that this was the old world. Like this was the world of the pre-Noah. Like there's so much evidence. There's so much evidence to show that like North America was the pre-flood world.
Wow.
Like without a doubt, like in the Bible, how they described what the Garden of Eden is, there's only one four-headed river in the entire world. And it's in Georgia. And it runs down into Florida.
Wow.
What they said, the boat, the ark that Noah built, there's only like one region in the world that grows that wood, gopher wood. And it's in Georgia, part of Arkansas, Georgia, and North Florida.
Whoa.
Arkansas.
Whoa.
And we now know that the Mississippi used to be called the Nile. Like there's so many different things where it's just like, and like when you look at like, I have a bunch of Mormon friends now, at least they grew up Mormon. I wouldn't say that they're Mormon now. You go through like Utah and like Nevada and up into Montana and like you run the line of the cities and stuff like that. It looks like you're looking at a geographical depiction of the Bible from the 1800s.
Wow.
Like there's a lot of correlates, a lot. So obviously it's nothing that we can prove right now, but I like the idea of that, especially like, because I think whenever you're dealing with a holographic text like the Bible, you will have certain things that are absolutely fact, and then you'll have certain things that are symbolic, you'll have certain things that are allegorical. What makes it a holographic text is what does it actually do to you? Where is it going on with you? And I want to touch back on when you're talking about channeled material. What occurs with the channeled material is the bad stuff doesn't usually happen to the channeler. I think that's very rare. Sometimes, like in my instance, it will come through. But a lot of times the channeler is being used as a vessel because that being is out of time to affect other people down the line.
Got it.
So in a teaching like human design, I got a lot of ego gratification. I was a human designer for 10 years professionally until I figured out that they were not using the correct star maps.
That's interesting.
Like they're just using they're using a tropical system that's actually not using what's actually in the sky.
Whoa.
So I'm like, okay, so this is more numerology. And numerology I found is about 60% accurate.
Okay.
It's between 60 and 65% accurate if you have a really good numerologist. And when you look at the Tao Te Ching and all that stuff, all that type of divination stuff that makes up human design. And when you look at Ra's life, like that dude, the guy who channeled human design, I bet you he was just used as a vessel. But what I saw in that world, when I started to get really deep into it, my now wife told me to get out of it. Because the deeper and deeper you go into that thinking of that system, you become like an insect.
What do you mean by that?
You totally taken out of the heart. Everything is like, oh, if this, then that, if this, then that.
It's just systematic.
It's like you become like one of these people that tries to follow every little thing in Leviticus.
Yeah.
You can't live life.
Right.
It's a total system orientation. There's no love. There's no joy. You get so hyper involved with the intellect that you're like, look at me. Look what I know. Look what I know. Look what I know. And you could just take it deeper and deeper and deeper. And you're totally taken out of the zone. You're totally taken out of the free flowing, spontaneous, energetic flow of life.
Mm-hmm.
Like it just takes you out. And I'm so happy she did that, because it was only like a month or two of us like living together. And, and once again, I got into it like really big time with her, because I was like trying to prove like how much I knew to her and all this stuff. And she's like, no, I love you because you're happy and joyous. Like you're a joyful person. And like the way you've been the last 3 days is not that. And it was really kind of funny, because I've seen that with other systems with channeled material. Mm-hmm. So getting back to the Bible in and of itself, it will pull out of a person whatever needs to be pulled out.
Yeah.
Whatever is supposed to be pulled out. But I think even with all of its modifications that have happened, you can still glean, at least as of right now. I'm not saying that this will always be this way, because I do see things are changing afoot. The core of it is written on my heart. Mm. The core of it is Jesus's teaching of the golden rule. Love thy neighbor as you love thyself. Love your Father in heaven with all your heart, and let the chips fall where they may. And that's really like the teaching that I got out of the Bhagavad Gita, like all these other Eastern, is like literally like do what's right without fear of consequences. Mm-hmm. Like that's the main gist. That's what should be written on one's heart. Mm-hmm. Then as things modify and change and warp and do all the things that they're going to do in this little season, you can just hold fast in your heartfelt experience, and then all of it resolves. Mm-hmm. Like there's like, from my perspective, all the shenanigans that are being given to us with data don't really become all that important.
No, especially because it's just like an attempt to perpetuate a narrative that we don't have to buy into, that is not real, that they're trying to use our ability to co-create this reality, both in the physical, but also in terms of like creating thought forms around things. Mm-hmm. They're like using us as weapons for those who aren't attuned to how powerful the mind is. Does that make sense? It's like,
totally. Yeah.
Like even in the truther space, for people who are perpetually focused on the doom and gloom narratives surrounding certain things, not that we shouldn't be aware of them, but like hyper fixated on them. You're like actually creating more of that. You're allowing your creative capacity to be used to bring about more of that.
Yeah, your energy. And I really figured this out, like that's why I will always build and I will always massage, is because I do have a tendency to like really explore things in a heady way. But I found a good while ago that like you have to ground out into the physical. At least I should say I have to. Mm-hmm. Like I have to ground out in the physical. I have to apply. Like to have wisdom, you have to apply your knowledge. Mm-hmm. And that's so cool. That's so cool. And that's why I feel like grateful that, I could have this like return into the quote unquote faith, even though the way I see it is so heretical.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's be honest, the majority of Christians want nothing to do
100%.
with preterism because they're.
We never answered that question, by the way. So the second temple that already happened. In summary, Christ already reigned on the earth. Then yeah.
So we don't know exactly when things occur because once again, the histrionics that we've been taught, like we brought up before, so much of it, there's an algorithm where they just change a couple of dates and it's the same story. So as the story goes with preterism is that Jesus actually did return in the flesh like he said he would. The reason why I like this is because I believe out of everything that I've read in the Bible, Jesus didn't lie. And like when he said, the people that speared me shall see me return. Like
literally the people. Yeah, not the people's like lineages down the line. He's talking about the actual guys who did it will see me return.
And there's people that have run the algos on like when he says verily, verily, or like whenever certain phraseologies use, like Michael Heiser was excellent at this. That phraseology is very specific of like immediate, like this means immediately, like this is going to happen. So what I do agree with the preterist view is that there was the 1,000-year reign, the actual millennial reign of Jesus, because he said that that's what would happen.
And that is maybe the architecture.
That's what I think.
That has to be the architecture.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Those are people that are impacted by the consciousness of the Christ, embodying it themselves, creating these beautiful, awe-inspiring structures in reverence to God.
Right.
Because Christ was reigning over the earth.
And it would have to be everybody involved. So to give you an example, and this harkens back to everything I've been talking about with my building, I build very weird things that are nowhere even near as gorgeous and beautiful as what these creations that we're talking about.
They're pretty rad, though.
They're pretty rad, though. What I've had to do in training people and pulling teeth just to get the wage slave, and when I say wage slave, I'm not being condescending. We all, in today's day and age, are somewhat of a wage slave.
You're a slave to like the wage and like having to work the 9 to 5 in the job. And in some cases, you don't even like it.
So half the slog of being a contractor / entrepreneur is not only are you battling the person that's paying you, you're battling the people that you're paying.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a battle because everybody overvalues their input. Everybody overvalues it. And so when you're dealing with that as the middleman, as the person that's actually, the captain of the ship, it's a slog, especially when you're doing things that nobody else has ever done. The reason why I bring this up is you would not have these enormous structures. Like these are enormous. Because when you build, I always tell people this, when you build, you have to think of the weight. It all comes down to weight at the end of the day. The reason why they can build these 110-story buildings now is because they're relatively light.
Mm.
They're using very, very light materials, like metal and glass and just a little bit of concrete. They're not using like some of these buildings that we're talking about that, the neoclassical architecture, just some of these like 4 and 5 story buildings outweigh, buildings that are 50 stories tall because their walls were 4 feet thick.
Mm.
They have foundations that go down into the ground, like, 3 or 4 times the height of the building. Like the earthworks that would have to be done when we're told that people were doing this with,
horse and buggy, hammer and chisel
with tools that aren't hard.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's all these type of, I wasn't an architecture student, but I've talked with people that know a lot about carving and sculpting. There's literally all these columns in Europe in Italy specifically, where they would literally carve the whole column out of one piece of marble. And it's not like they had sandpaper and buffering. There's no chisel marks. And I'm saying this was absolutely done by human hands, but inspired human hands.
Mm-hmm.
These were people that were not working for money. These were not people that have to deal with all the rigmarole that like a modern day construction worker has to go through.
And they damn sure weren't people who were having to balance out fighting a two-front war and all that stuff either.
And then you get into like stories of like the Palace of Versailles. So I brought up earlier, the first thing that you do when you're doing a construction development is you put in the roads. Before you build your roads, you build your infrastructure under the road, because you don't want to put in a nice road to handle all this weight and then not have like all your conduit and pipes and water, right? So I saw this Discovery documentary on the waterworks of the Palace of Versailles. And this was like a 20-year-old documentary. And as the story goes, this is me in my old way of thinking, right? But this is the storyline that we're given. The Palace of Versailles is uphill from a river that's about 4 miles away, where they drew all their water from. And the water, they figured out a very neat system of moving the water uphill all the way to the Palace of Versailles. To this day, the waterworks work. Huge fountains go off, have all this timing, beautiful gardens outside.
When was this allegedly built?
I forget. Let's just say during the millennial reign of Christ.
Okay. Like actually.
In actuality.
They'll probably say like 1800s, 1700s, 1600s by, anyway, okay.
But here's the funniest thing. They have enough intelligence to push water uphill. They have enough intelligence not only to push water uphill, but to pressurize it to the point where you could have all these crazy fountains. They have the pneumatic wherewithal to be able to channel the water through wastegate systems and all this stuff. But you know what they forgot to do? They forgot to put bathrooms in the building. So we see all these movies, we see all these artistic depictions of the French royalty and the regalia of the Palace of Versailles. And when you talk to a historian, so what do they do to go to the bathroom? You know what they were wearing. It wasn't like, you and I, we just like
slip off your pants. Yeah.
No. These were men in tights.
Right.
These were women with 18 layers of the finest silks and stuff like that. You're literally talking about a building that has gold leaf that goes up 40 feet inside some of these main rooms. I forget how many hundreds of rooms this thing has. And then all the water pumping that you could ever need. It's like Roman aqueducts. You have all this working, but yet we're told that they had outhouses. So you're saying, okay, you're like King Louis, whatever, and you have your royal court and everybody's dining the finest feasts and whatever. But hey, no, you got to go out to the outhouse. I build, and I always build thinking of women. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, you could have the nicest house in the world. If she doesn't have a nice bathroom that's easy to get to, you're in trouble, man. So you're telling me these women back then, so like imagine you're like the queen of the king that just built the Palace of Versailles.
Wearing 18 layers.
And homeboy pumped water and he's like pontificating on the brilliance of the engineers. But yet there's not a single bathroom in the Palace of Versailles. And in fact, when you start to go into the history of a lot of these buildings that before they took them down, because a lot of these buildings, these old world buildings that are so magnificent through Germany, through like Pennsylvania, through all these different regions of the world, all the bathrooms were added to these buildings. They were secondary. Mm-hmm. And this harkens me back to when I was really when I read this book called Where Did the Towers Go? By the mechanical engineer, Dr. Judy Wood. she noticed that.
And she correct me if I'm wrong. She talks about it from a dew perspective, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. She was totally like, I was actually
no planes. This is very clearly.
I was actually part of one of her studies, which is really cool.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because I have a weird thing because I've been in the middle of a tornado and the middle of a hurricane.
Dude, between you and Mike Wilkerson, both of you have had the most like fantastic lives of just so many different threads. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So, and I really love Mike.
He's the man.
He's a dude.
Yeah.
So Judy Wood points out in her book that essentially when you look at the she did forensic autopsy of the photographs of the rubble. And she noticed something really quickly, that there were no toilets in the rubble. Now, after analyzing the rubble, 80% of the buildings never made it to the ground. But between the two buildings, there were 2,000 bathrooms. Excuse me, not 2,000 bathrooms. There should have been 2,000 toilets. So you should have
seen...
Between
the two towers. We're talking about the Twin Towers.
The Twin Towers. Okay. You should have seen some porcelain on the ground.
Yeah.
There was none. And that really made her wonder. So I had that going on in the back of my mind. When I was watching this thing with the Palace of Versailles, I was like, where are the toilets? Like I always have that on my mind now. And now learning like all these people, like my lunch break and all these different people that are going through like the elevations of these buildings, like none of them have like any, like all the bathrooms that were put in for people like you and me were retrofitted. They weren't part of the original design of the buildings. And now I'm also somebody that builds rocket mass heaters and installs these very efficient systems that funnel heat through convection. And in learning that trade, I had to learn what makes a good fireplace. And there's all this evidence that the majority of spaces that were used in a lot of these buildings, they were used as fireplaces, but they weren't good fireplaces. They were way too shallow. They didn't ventilate properly. Too much carbon and soot would get into the room. And when they would enter these buildings, when they first initially started to use them, there were no carbon marks. All that became a secondary and tertiary thing when new tenants would come in. So the grand picture of, let's say, the millennial reign of Christ is there's an actual physical embodiment. You and I are athletes that are around dudes, like around men that will only take leadership from somebody that's better than them. Like you and I know how it goes.
100%.
The ego only bows to the greater power. So like, if you're out there hooping it up with Jordan, you're going to be like, you're going to concede. Okay. That's Jordan. Like, all right, he's the man.
Right.
But if you're playing against Shlomo down the street, you're going to dunk all over him and you're going to be the man to him. So Jesus says he's the Alpha and the Omega. By definition, there can only be one Alpha. My feeling is that during the millennial reign of Christ, he was the Alpha here. That dark ages that we're told about in his story wasn't the dark ages at all. It was actually the light ages. Right. And you had inspired work, and you had inspired work in every nation. And at that time that you had this inspired work in the nation doesn't mean that everybody agreed or bowed knee, because it even says in the Bible, not everybody, for those who disobey, for those who don't pay homage on a yearly basis, they will be afflicted with no rain. That's the penance that you pay for not bending a knee, for not genuflecting. And so that makes sense, because when you look at the earth out of the area that we know of geographically, a third of it is desert. A third of it is afflicted with no rain. It's like literally like, it's like too many of these things are falling into place. Right. And so he has his millennial reign. The Bible says he goes ahead and ascends with the camp of the saints. And then the devil is loosed upon the world for a little season. The original translation is the accuser is loosed upon the world for a little while to deceive the nations. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And
do you think we're in the midst of that, if the timeline is correct? Yeah.
I really do. Because like I said, like we were talking about earlier, everything that we've ever been told that's worth anything, we've been lied to about.
100%. Yeah.
Now, in our everyday life, that's not what's going on. That's from the powers and principalities.
Right.
That's from the beings that would want to have agency over you, which is technically evil. That's what evil is. Evil is, I could give a shit what your will is. My will be done. That's what evil is. And if the envious one is truly as envy as the Bible says, of course he's going to lie to you about everything, because when you believe lies, your energetic field collapses. Your potential collapses.
Your decision-making also leads to
what
is possibly a total collapse of you in this realm.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And so that's what I see is happening. And then the mandala effect, to put the cherry on top of the whole thing, is that the Mandela effect was essentially predicted in the Bible also. Because as that deception runs its course, everything changes to the point where you cannot have an idol in this world. Which I have found that before I came across any of this stuff, I had found to actually be the healthiest way to navigate my life.
Never make anything an idol.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. Because I had done that earlier in my life, and it was extremely destructive. And so I really think, you put your creator first, you love him with all your heart, and then let the chips fall where they may. Like that's like the idolship things out there is not, it doesn't work out well.
Right.
And the people that I feel that like come with all this vitriol whenever new information comes, it's very obvious that they have an idol.
Right.
It's very obvious. And that's also what I've noticed about entrainment technology, like the current digital entrainment technology, is people will have idols that they're not even aware of. They don't even know that that's what's going on. It's like, incepted into their, physiology.
Right.
And then they're just running a program. That took me a while to figure out what that actually was in my clients. Because it's actually felt as a surrogate. That's the way it feels.
Sometimes I feel like it's a struggle to name what the idol actually is, because the idol might be an ideology that is an idol. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
Like even in the just top of mind black pill truther space, where they're so afraid that everyone is co-opted, everything's a psyop, all they're focused on is the darkness. And then when let's say, this is probably a poor example, but it's like, hey, no, Kyrie Irving, I don't think is a fully bought out celebrity. He might actually not be on like the Illuminati side and things like this. He might not be a Freemason. I don't know if that's true or not, but for the sake of the point, it's like you show that to them, you're like, hey, no, not all sports are rigged. I understand a lot of them are, but like this right here would be very, very hard to rig. And I just don't think so. Like when it comes to basketball now, are referees bought out and things like this? Absolutely, I would agree with that. But like Steph Curry isn't like, there's no magnet on that ball to make him make it more than other people. There's just no way. Like anyone who's played basketball at a high level, even high school, would be like, no, there's no chance. Nope. My point is, like, you point that out to someone like that, and they're like, no. I even had that in my comments on Facebook the other day, where someone was like, I can't believe that you would even post about how you played handball. Like, don't you know that all sports are rigged? And I was like, well, I literally played. And I played at a high level, and I can tell you that it wasn't rigged. But like the point is that you point that out to someone, and I know you played sports too, so this is actually like a relevant example for you as well. Yes. Like you point that out to someone, and it goes against their whole ideology that they have made an idol, and that they're a black pillar and everything's a psyop. And the moment they're presented with something that like, it pokes hole in their whole ideology that they've adopted, they can't face it, and they go into straight cognitive dissonance. They lash out, they block you, like all the same things. And it's ironic when it's coming from the quote truther space too, because it's like they call it out in other people, but it's like, it's so hard for us, especially those who are questioning reality like we do, that we would fall into, quote, truther camps as it is, which does incorporate some of these black pill people, so to speak. For us, it's important to, I don't know, not catch ourselves, but be cognizant of that we can fall into the idolship as well,
right,
without realizing it.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's where my maturity, like where I've seen maturity help. Because I can't judge those people all that much because I used to idolize things left, right, and center, and it just took a lot of bruises and bumps to understand oh, wait a minute, that's not the way to go. That's really not. And so I don't really get attached to things. That's why the spiritual principles that we were talking about earlier really free me from actually making, it's literally the second commandment. There was some intelligence there, don't make false idols. And it's a thing. It's a real easy trap. I'll say for myself, it was a very easy trap to fall into. And so now for me, I don't identify as any of a truther or
right.
I don't even identify as a podcaster. You guys are asking me for a bio. I'm I don't even know what to write about myself. I'm
Topher Gardner is the man and he crushes. That's his bio.
Sometimes I massage, sometimes I build, sometimes I sculpt, sometimes I just trying to figure stuff out.
There we go. We'll throw that little sound bit between me and you at the very beginning. That's Topher Gardner.
Cause it's it's so funny because what I've seen is things aren't fixed.
Right.
Even that's why I love the exploration of retrocausality and the Mandela effect. I have direct, private, personal experience of things are not as fixed as they supposedly are. I've had supernatural things occur in my life where no, if physics really behaved the way you say physics should, I would be dead right now.
Wow.
What was occurring and what actually occurred. There's just there's more going on. And it's very nice for, I would say, the majority to have their fixed materialist ways of looking at things. I myself am not that. I find that this is just spiritual condensate. Depending on where your attention is and depending on what God wants for you, will relieve itself into what you're exposed to, which will relieve itself into what your subjective experience is.
Beautiful. There's so many things I want to cover with you as well, but we've already gone 3.5 hours, so maybe I'll narrow it down to, because we didn't even talk about biochar. There's some things related to, that's another one of your whole things. Literally your brand name is based off that, but I actually want to save that. Maybe we'll save that for another time. I want to get into a little bit more Victor Schauberger stuff.
Oh, nice. Yeah, because you're really going into the water studies now.
Yeah, man. I'm obsessed. So, yes. Yeah, very open-ended, I guess. Just what?
So I can get into this because we started talking about domes and we're talking about the phi ratio. So there's a really neat thing with water, okay? Because I'm sort of in the Tom Cowan camp of what are atoms anyway? Has anybody seen an atom?
Right.
If you study at all Walter Russell stuff, which I know you're going to be talking with Matt soon. I love Walter and Lau Russell's depiction of what the elements are and what just matter is overall. And essentially what it is, it's a probability field that collapses. And different probability fields have different potentials and different oscillation and frequencies, right? And we're experiencing an amalgamation of that. That's all it is, okay? So there's one very specific relationship that all of life, anything that lives, is built on. And it's the relationship between hydrogen and oxygen. And as best as we can tell, because like I said, I'm in Tom Cowan's camp, oxygen, as it relates to hydrogen, when those probability fields are collapsing, they collapse in it's known as the only incommensurate geometry that we know of. And the way you could draw it is it would be a pyramid where you have 36 degrees at the edges of your pyramid. And then you have 108 degrees at the top. And you're like, that's not a pyramid. I thought all pyramids were like 52-degree arc angle at the top, like the Great Pyramid of Giza and all that stuff. They are if you look dead on at the pyramid at one angle. But the second you turn it to where you could see 1/3 of one side and 2/3 of the front side, or a better way of saying is 1/3 of the pyramid as one side and the front fascia as the other 2/3.
Is this assuming that the pyramid has 4 sides, though?
Yes.
Because it technically has 8.
Yeah, there's indentations.
Yeah, indentation. Okay, but still looking at one face.
At one face.
2/3.
It's like, it's how you would experience it. If you're standing on the Giza Plateau and you're looking at the Great Pyramid.
You can see 1/3 of one face, 2/3 of the other face at the angle you're at.
That is the 108, 36, 36.
Okay.
That is that. And it's encoded because the H2O, as we know it, like if you talk to Gerald Pollack, it's H3O4. You can talk to all these other people. But once again, I'm in the camp of Cowan. Who and when and what and where are you actually observing all this stuff? Okay. But just let's look at the relationship of the two progenitors of all biological life, hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen being the primordial, the first. It's actually what begets everything else. And then oxygen is like the male element of like will, like let's go. So you have those two things in relationship to each other. They have this beautiful dynamic, this 36, 36, 72. Now this is what all the Hermeticists have built all of their science on, is this incommensurate geometry. Because when you take that triangle and you do it in triplicate off the apex angle and you turn it at 72 degrees, now you have the Vitruvius Man. You have the pentagram that, Christians say are satanic. It's not satanic, it's just powerful. Mm-hmm. And that's actually what I built my domes off of. All my domes use this phi ratio triangle, because that phi ratio, like when I said you turn the pyramid where you see 1/3 of it and 2/3 of the other side, make up the whole thing, that is the phi ratio.
Wow.
And it makes that incommensurate geometry. And what makes it incommensurate is you could bisect it ad infinitum and it always doubles angles. It always. Yeah. And so it's fractal.
Yeah.
So it's like the only fractal depiction that we can see in one snapshot, all the way down and all the way up.
Wow.
As one picture. And that's why water is the memory. It is the intelligence, because it's the ultimate antenna. Wow. Because we're talking about shapes. Shapes beget resonance. The very substructure of what makes this fluid that every living thing needs for life, the very substructure of it is an infinite fractal antenna. So it literally does have all the memory. It does have all, because it's an antenna. It's literally pulling in out of the ethers whatever that zone, location, or whatever it needs, wants, or whatever. That's why it reacts to will. Mm-hmm. That's why it reacts to prayer. That's why it will just come out of nowhere also. Like
literally pulling it out of the ether.
Literally, like I've dealt with devices that like, okay, this only holds 16 ounces. And then you do resonance things and now you have 32 ounces being poured out of a 16-ounce cup. Now, I didn't do it with a cup. I did it with a 1 liter Mojo cell.
Yeah.
But how can I pour 1.5 liters out of something that can only hold a liter?
Can you talk about the Mojo cell a little bit? Because we were talking about that yesterday.
Yeah, so the Mojo cell is an Orgone accumulator. So we're talking about water. Mm-hmm. So you have active, I call them active Orgone accumulators. An active orgone accumulator is something that uses a living medium. And I consider water a living medium as being the transducer for this orgone field. And as we were talking about yesterday, the orgone to me is protium. It's light hydrogen. It's when you have the metaphysical condenses in its first iteration of the physical material is protium. Wilhelm Reich, the gentleman who coined the phrase orgone, he called that protium, or he called that a bion. And when you had a field of bions, you had orgone. Mm-hmm. And he termed this after like when you have an orgasm between the polarities of a heterosexual. That's why life comes through when the male and female polarities there, is because now when the two come together in thy name, boom, the third appears. Mm-hmm. There's extra. It's literally pulled from the ether. It's bionic. Mm-hmm. Like it's these bions, it's this protein. I call it protium. I think I'm the only weirdo that's out there calling orgone protium, but it makes sense to me the more I learn about hydrogen. So it creates a field effect with wherever the hydrogen, wherever this protium, wherever this orgone is, it creates a field of quality. So if you put it around a person, it upregulates their system. And you know all about upregulation. Mm. If you put it around a mechanical device, it upregulates that mechanical device. Electrical device, same thing. If that electrical device is antithetical to human biology or biology as a whole, it stops the device from working.
Wow.
And so that's why people will use non-active orgone accumulators. Like they'll have all these like pendants or pyramids and stuff.
Yeah.
And they're really cool. Like I love that stuff. And it does have an effect. It does signal your environment that at least you're aware of it. And that helps. But when you deal with like something like a Mojo cell, where it's a sphere within a sphere within a sphere within a sphere, and then you fill that with charged water, like structured water, and then you send a harmonic and a frequency through it that creates a resonance within the water, you get some really dynamic quality change. I should call it qualitative dynamic changes in your environment. Mm. Yeah. And so I teamed up with Dr. Moshe Daniel with this in 2008, I think was the first time. No, end of 2007. And so I've been like, in his back pocket, always being like, hey, let's do this, And he has so many other endeavors and things like that. But right now he's actually looking to have them printed again.
Really?
Yeah.
So they're 3D printed?
No, they're stamped.
Stamped. Okay.
I should have said stamped.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. They're stainless steel. And I just happen to live like, within an hour and a half of like the stainless steel capital of the United States, Springfield, Missouri. But my goodness, are things expensive to stamp in the United States? Uh-huh. Like it's like exorbitant expensive to do that.
Does it have to be metal?
Well, the thing with stainless steel is,
because like, isn't it all about the geometry? Well, I won't say all about the geometry rather than the material, but like it's more about the geometry and the shape and the.
So Wilhelm Reich found something out that was really interesting with orgone. You always want to have a conductive surface.
Okay. So that in this case, you would want metal.
You want to have a conductor that's non-magnetic, that's what makes stainless steel.
Got it.
It has enough nickel in it where it doesn't propagate a magnetic field, mm-hmm. but it will propagate an electrical field. And so, Mojo was brilliant, and this could kind of lead into the biochar. He was the one who started teaching me about diamagnetism. So we were talking about paramagnetism and how I've
heard you talk about that diamagnetic earth versus paramagnetic earth. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what he was doing in the middle of his Mojo cells was he was putting bismuth. And bismuth is a metal that is the most diamagnetic metal that we know of. Diamagnetic. Diamagnetism means that it resists an electrical field in all directions. A weak electrical field. Mm-hmm. And his idea was if the cathode I always forget which one's which. When the cathode and anode are signaling each other, like when you have the positive and negative, and you're sending whatever frequency range that you're doing, the water will end up essentially trying to mitigate the difference between the positive and the negative.
Mm-hmm.
The way this is different than electrolysis. In electrolysis, they're just trying to essentially fry the water. They're trying to they'll add an electrolyte to the water, and then they'll up the amps with what they're sending through the water.
This is the Kangen water systems and why they're harmful.
Yeah, I've talked a lot.
I don't want to go off on a tangent on that, but
yeah. This is what my ideal with this isn't electrolysis.
Mm-hmm.
My ideal is actually when you're signaling the water in a form like a sphere that it likes.
Yep.
And you create a concrescence where then the water itself will start to maybe induce extra proteum, because proteum isn't from here. It is in a way, like you can collect it, but you can also, it's primordial hydrogen. It's like the light hydrogen. And so if you make the way I see it and the way I've experienced, when you make the water really, really happy, it gives you more happiness. It gives you more. It's like, oh, you get it. And it will just create more of itself. And it's like an endless thing if you know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is I don't know what I'm doing. And I've had strokes of luck here and there where I've achieved resonance with these systems and had excellent results. And I've had what would be considered over unity, like +1. Like if you put in like 1 joule of energy, you receive 1.5 joules on the output. Like I've had a liter, these things only hold a liter. I've had 1.5 liters come out.
Wow.
And at that point of like pouring it, like that was a surprise to me because I had just had a 1 liter Pyrex cup. And then I had to call for my wife to bring in another cup because it kept pouring it out. And that water, I ended up drinking it as an experiment. And like, I didn't have to eat for like 4 days.
Whoa. Was this the water that you ran through?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, that was just the Mojo stuff.
That's a whole other,
yeah. No,
this is the problem with you, man. This is the problem is there's so much to talk about.
I had so much time. Like I really, like when I moved to Costa Rica, I was just given time to like really explore Schauberger.
Yeah.
And Schauberger was very much, his whole message, at least in my consciousness, was like really biomimic. Like the more you can biomimic, the more on the path you are, and really understand the water of life. And when you look at the Bible too, like what did Jesus give? He gave the water of life.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what he gave.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's right there, And so it's just like, and when you start to really experience like higher quality water, like whether you swim in it or drink in it, your whole demeanor, everything in your life, the quality of your life just gets so much better.
Mm-hmm.
Like on every level, like you just start to relax in ways. Like I grew up in South Florida where the water was horrible down there. Like our water table was like right underneath the house. Like it was all brackish water. So the chlorine in the water,
right.
Disgusting. And so it wasn't until my early 30s where I actually started to get good water and like everything in my system changed.
Yeah.
To the point now, like the last 5 properties I bought, I don't even look at a property unless I know the water is at least starting out at above average,
because
then
you can do some things yourself to bring it into
coherence. Definitely. Yeah.
Makes sense. Man, we didn't get into your cosmology. We didn't get into like barely touched on diamagnetic versus paramagnetic as it relates to the earth, but also the sun and the moon. Like there's so much to touch there. I'm gonna have to like because I don't want to make you come back out here. I'm gonna have to like make a point to come to Missouri. I mean, I have family in Kansas City. I grew up in Kansas City, so I have good reason to come that way anyway. So we could do a part 2 to discuss
that'd be great
all that stuff, man. Yeah.
Yeah, you look busted up over there.
I'm not busted up. I'm more so like this conversation has been incredible, and I'm sad that Yeah, because I mean, we could go for another hour and a half, 2 hours, but I think part 2 makes more sense for the listener because it'll end up being like
that'd be a lot
5 to 6 hour episode. But man,
no, it's good stuff. Like the diamagnetism stuff, like that's so much fun because all of this stuff is just like pressure mediation. It's all just like one thing moving from one phase to another, all of it. Like whether we're talking about the spirituality, the physical, the mental, the emotional, it's all just pressure mediation. It's all just like, there's action, and then that action creates an effect, and that effect creates a zone or a field, and then that field needs to propagate, and then that's all that we're like really talking about.
Yeah, physically and metaphysically.
Yeah. And so to me, it's all like one big thing.
Yeah.
It's not like a lot of different things. That's why I can like wax rhapsodic about it forever.
Yeah, and that's why you can like kind of dance in all these worlds because there's a common thread.
It really is. It's like it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
Like it's just like it's like being a multi-sport athlete.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing is like in scouting, you always want the multiple sport guys because they're just more well-rounded.
Totally.
But when you talk to them, they're like the one thing informs the other and the other thing informs the other.
The perfect example is me picking up handball because like there was direct translation from both pieces of football and basketball that married well in handball that you could just get.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're doing that like both in sports, but also like metaphysically and then biochar and then cosmology, body work, all of it, man. Jack of all trades. But Topher, thanks for joining me, man. This was awesome.
Yeah, it's so great to see you again, Alec. I really appreciate meeting you in Mexico. And this is just like furthering our friendship. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me, man.
My pleasure.